Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Protector of the Fairies in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Protector of the Fairies. Farewell, my old friend. When Ichigo found his vision returning to focus to the world around him, he found himself floating in the air for a brief moment. It was like everything had been lifted up around them and that it was beginning to fall first before they did. As fast as he could, he took everything in around him, and in that moment he saw Waiwak off balance from shock. No time was wasted. Before Waiwak could even realize he had forced his consciousness back to the surface, he acted, the element of surprise still on his side. Uriah spotted him first right as he reached the air behind Waiwak, and he was sure the shock in his ally's eyes had warned Waiwak now. The Quincy King's head was even beginning to turn towards him. So before Waiwak could have any time to react, he would end this right now. His right blade swung down, the unstable energy coating it blocking his sight for a brief instant right as the blade was about to make contact with Waiwak's neck. Right before it did, however, something odd happened. Waiwak had managed to turn enough that one eye was now visible, and right before his sword could strike, the man's eye had changed slightly. For a moment, it had appeared like there had been two pupils there. He couldn't explain what he had felt right then. It was almost like he had been stripped bare. Like Waiwak had seen everything he had been about to do with but one glance. And when his sword struck, the reality he got was not the one he had expected. For in his hand, there was no blade at all. Shock filled his body at the sight of his empty hand. Even the energy that cloaked his hand had vanished, revealing a completely pale hand to the world around it. Before he even had a chance to recover, Waiwak was slicing at him with a sword of his own, barely blocked in time with his other blade. The impact still sent him reeling back, and he had to force himself to slow down rapidly as the ground around them settled from whatever had lifted the base up in the first place. But he couldn't relax yet. An attack would be coming from Waiwak any moment now. Except it never did. The moment for a strike passed, and Ichigo found his gaze widening in confusion at the sight of Waiwak before him. With one hand gripping the left side of his head, the Quincy King was covering the same left eye he had seen change with an expression he didn't think he had truly seen on Waiwak before. One of pain. Whatever was causing the pain, it was severe enough that Uriah was even able to reach his side once again, both of them facing Waiwak hesitantly. "He took your power, right?" Ichigo asked cautiously, hoping that what he saw was wrong. But his sight didn't lie when he saw Uriah nod his head. The link that had once existed between them because of Waiwak's power was gone now, and with it so was the large amount of power Uriah had been capable of tapping into through him. "Do we fight or flee?" Uriah muttered under his breath, keeping his eyes locked on Waiwak at all times. "He appears like he may be still adjusting to his power. We may not have lost our chance yet." Ichigo frowned before glancing down at his exposed hand. The energy still around his body was just about able to respond to his will, but it wasn't regenerating probably. The source was probably because of Waiwak's actions, disrupting his Quincy powers greatly and sending the cloak of energy that he wore into disarray. What was more, he couldn't even remake a sword in his right hand now. It was completely empty despite his best attempts. This was bad. If he couldn't make the swords he made normally, almost any form he could make with this power was drastically weaker. And with how much of a beating his magical power had taken already from the earlier fight and having Waiwak ripping his own power back from his soul, he doubted he could last too much longer. The only issue was that retreat was not an easy option to make. Even if Waiwak was currently in pain, that wouldn't deter the man from chasing them down, nor would it stop him from shooting down the Genesis. If the Quincy King had to choose which of them he would prevent from escaping, however. "Can you get in contact with Hibiki?" Ichigo asked quietly, watching for any signs of recovery from Waiwak. "I need you to pass on a message." "You think he'll let me get that chance?" "He will if I make him," Ichigo replied honestly. "If he has his power back now, you aren't a threat to him in his eyes." "That's what I'd assume at least. And if he has to priorities, he'll go for the one still able to challenge him to tie up loose ends." Glancing at Waiwak hesitantly, Uriah took a single step away. Waiwak's gaze turned towards him ever so slightly, but the step forward from Ichigo had Waiwak's gaze shifting right back. Ichigo was right. In the current situation, he could escape so long as Ichigo remained. "What do you need me to say?" Tell them to pull everyone out. We're running for it. A full retreat it is. Anything else? Ichigo paused before nodding, turning his head towards Uriu slightly. Prison cells, 10 minutes. Tell Hibiki to be leaving exactly 10 minutes after you first start speaking to him, and make sure you contact him the moment you leave here. I can't stress how important it is that you get those timings exactly right. Got that? Uriu frowned but nodded. Very well. Stay safe. Seeing his moment, Uriu took off running, Waiwak immediately preparing to cut him off. He never got a chance as, the second he showed a single sign of attacking, Ichigo was already at him, slashing down with the cloaked sword of energy in his left hand. Waiwaka's own blade came up to meet it, but he was almost caught off guard when Ichigo's right hand shot straight towards his face, narrowly avoiding the blow as he tilted his body while stepping away. Before any retaliation could be made, Ichigo fell back to where he had started from, his left sword held up at the ready in front of his body. He had already bought Uriu enough time to escape. Now he just had to buy those 10 minutes. Mavis? You up for this? Leave it to me, he heard the girl say in response, a smile coming to his face at her confidence. He was lucky that. Why are you smiling? He felt his thoughts grind to a halt. Smiling? Waiwak could see him smiling? His right hand shot to his face only to feel none of the familiar energy at his fingertips. There was nothing there. This was bad. His cloak wasn't just not regenerating. It was also breaking away. He tried to reach for more energy from around him, but it was harder than before, the usual powers he used to call upon it struggling to work as he was used to. They were too diminished, and now he was paying the price for it right now. Letting out a sigh, he willed whatever was left of the cloak to leave his body, directing it all towards his right arm and letting it condense as tight as he could. Hopefully like this he could reduce the energy lost until a time he really needs it. Even if it means taking away the cover it gave him. As the darkness of his magic was stripped away, what was underneath his skin as white as bone. Unusual, Waiwak said suddenly, looking at him as if pieces of a puzzle had finally been fitted together to reveal a clear image. I see now what you've been doing. Why you've been hiding yourself away in that cloak of energy you call Bankai. How ingenious, to hide a lie in truth. Not sure what you're talking about, Ichigo shot back, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck standing on edge. There was no way Waiwak had realized that quickly, right? Who was he kidding? Waiwak knew. He knew the man did. I should be the one asking what you are doing though. I'm sure I had you earlier. Oh, you did, Waiwak replied calmly. Congratulations, I guess should have been in order. You worked superbly to take advantage of such an opportune moment. I was still reeling from the feeling of my power being at full strength once again when that shockwave hit. Gildart's Clive I believe must have been the source. I would recognize such dangerous magical power anywhere. However, I'm afraid that all that luck was simply not enough. Just because you caught me off guard, doesn't mean you caught all of me off guard. Ichigo, he's dangerous, he heard Mavis mutter softly to him, her voice laced with worry. He doesn't lie. Which means the truth behind those words is not something to take lightly. I know, Ichigo muttered back, his eyes narrowing at Waiwak before he asked, what the hell does that even mean? What on earth did you do with that eye of yours? Not something I should need to do again in our fight right now, Waiwak replied simply. I have already dealt the last blow necessary to crush your strength here. Even if you try and bring out that power you call Bankai, I myself can simply call upon my own power once again. And between the two of us, who do you think will win judging by our current states? Waiwak was right. Even so, keeping the man talking was help in itself. And what makes you think this power of mine right now isn't enough to crush you without your full power? I've still got plenty of life left in me. Because I noticed it when I looked at that blade of yours. Cloak it as well as you want in that energy of yours, these eyes can see all. And if I'm not mistaken, isn't that the same blade you used in your old fake Bankai? Ichigo's eyes glanced down at the blade held in his left hand, the energy around it retreating back to reveal the same familiar blade he had used in many battles in the past. And here I was hoping you wouldn't have noticed. How could I not? If I'm not mistaken, you must have been replacing and reinforcing those two blades you hold to such extremes. I wouldn't be surprised if you've been modifying their lengths at times too to take full advantage of the cloak that hid them. So long as no one realized, the illusion would remain intact. So if we're done, why don't you bring back out those Shikai blades of yours? Ichigo made no move to listen to his request. Oh? You can't, can you? No wonder you won't make a new blade. You can't replace them right now, can you? And you still think you have a chance against me? I got enough of one, Ichigo stated as he raised his blade up, the energy around his arm spiraling upwards and around the blade. And I'm not losing it yet. Get Yuga Tenshou. This is pointless now, Waiwak stated, taking a step towards the wall of energy without a single shred of fear. With one hand raised, he only had to reach out and touch the energy if he wished to scatter it around him. But of course, you surely know that too. Which is why it makes your actions so predictable. Rather than scattering the energy when he touched it, he instead split it before having it reconverge behind him as he released his sword and used his now free hand as a guide. The energy struck just as Ichigo came to a stop, shock in his eyes but still fast enough to block the majority of the blast with his blade. Before it could submerge him in the blast, his sword swung up and scattered the energy around him. Waiwak had already closed the gap in the time it took to do that, however, a new sword present in the Quincy King's hand as he swung. Leaping back, he barely avoided the blow as he brought his sword back down, deflecting the first of the many arrows sent his way to pin him down. Each one was making sure that he would not be able to move about easily, perfect for narrowing Waiwaka's vision of his movements and making him easier to target. One arrow finally broke through, slamming into his shoulder and sending him off balance. Normally he still would have a blade to use even in such a state, but Waiwak had been clever, making sure to target his left shoulder so that his blade was the furthest away that it could be. In that moment Waiwak struck himself, his blade slashing down across his chest before he could completely dodge and leaving a large gash across his chest. He could feel the wound beginning to close, but he was sure he shouldn't have gotten hurt in the first place. He still should have been fast enough to dodge. So why? He understood. He was slowing down. He still had to buy some more time, but the fact his speed was dropping threw matters into question. His speed was the only advantage that he had against Waiwak right now, and if it dropped any further. How long, Mavis? He muttered, hearing her response and scowling at it. Still too much time. He had to press the offensive while he could so that there would be an opening to escape in when the time comes. So he charged, his blade clashing against Waiwaka's own in a series of blows. He couldn't rest, couldn't hesitate, as doing so would invite counterattack. So he kept pushing, forcing Waiwak back step by step as he struck as fast as he could. He may have only had one blade, but he hadn't spent years using it for those skills to rust. So long as he kept up this assault, he could last a bit longer. Arrows flew at him and forced him to disengage, but then he was right back at Waiwak the second the man tried to regain ground, the process repeating itself over and over again. He wasn't thinking on much. All that crossed his mind was the time, slowly counting down as he tried to work out how much longer he had to do this for. Finally that time came though, right as Waiwak himself made another push. He let it happen, leaping back to dodge the arrows while spinning in the air. His foot pressed down against the ground as it brushed across it, and he kicked off as fast as he could, rushing towards the way Uriah had left in. He knew it wouldn't be that simple, however. Waiwak was on his tail the moment the Quincy King released what he was up to, and he was gaining rather quickly too. Had his speed already dropped so much? No matter. He had the head start he needed. He just had to run and try not to look back. Where are you running off to? That was Waiwaka's voice, right behind his ear. He moved on instinct, just in time to stop a swing from a blade from landing squarely over his neck and divert it across his right arm. The limb fell loosely by his side, but he knew it would be back up and working in a few moments if he could just buy that time. Waiwak, however, showed no signs of letting up, striking with a flurry of strikes while arrows slammed down from all directions. The combination left no openings, which meant his only chance was to make them, his sword slashing up and knocking away some of the arrows as he caught Waiwaka's blade against his own. It had meant to stop the strike. Instead his blade shattered upon impact with Waiwaka's own, finally hitting its limit and leaving the blade of his opponents to slash into him. Arrows slammed into his joints and pinned him back against the wall, holding him there as he struggled to break free. He'd tear them out through force if he needed to, so long as he was able to move. The final strike was already coming from Wywak, heading right for his neck. He had to dodge. That was not a strike he could recover from. He had to move. Now. Wywaka's blade reached him before he could break free of his bonds. And yet still the sword stopped, held there by a new blade exactly like the one that had been destroyed previously. The wielder turned to look at Ichigo for a moment, the sight of his savior making him he was thinking he was seeing double for a brief moment. Until he recognized the man before him and why he seemed so familiar. Zanjitsu. The old man glanced at Ichigo for a moment through his broken shades before giving him a smile. With a snap of the man's fingers the arrows broke apart, letting Ichigo drop from the wall and for his wounds to begin regenerating. "Run," the old man said simply, his smile never dimming as he stared at his wielder. "Before it's too late. I'll hold him off." "Thanks Zanjitsu. I owe you one." Quickly taking off into a run, Ichigo shot back down the way he was trying to go, feeling the prickling sensation of something coming from behind him. He didn't have anything to fear from it however, the sound of metal slamming into the walls behind him and halting whatever attack had been chasing him in its tracks. As the last of his wounds healed he felt the power around him finally end completely, his speed dropping down to the level of his Shikai as he continued to run. "Mavis. I'm sorry, I couldn't help maintain the focus any longer. Not if you want to use this plan of yours." "It's fine," Ichigo replied. "Zanjitsu is going to buy us some time. Remind me to thank him later on for doing this." Mavis was oddly quiet for the moment, causing a shred of doubt to blossom in his mind. "Mavis? Is anything wrong?" "No," Mavis finally replied, an odd tone to her voice. "It's nothing. Just trying to get the coordinates for this spell correct. You've never had a problem before." "What's the issue?" "I'm just out of practice." "This is a bit harder." She cut her own words off, and if he could see her he would swear she had just covered her mouth with her hands. What she had said wouldn't have been odd if it had been anyone else saying it. But for her, those words could be nothing but lies. "Mavis. What aren't you telling me?" "I'll explain later." "Why later? We've got time right now. Please Ichigo. Just trust me. You don't want to know this now." Ichigo frowned. She was trying to protect him from something. But he couldn't sense anything around him that could have been a threat. What on earth was she trying to hide that she felt she could say freely later? Surely it couldn't hurt, and with the old man guarding their retreat then they had. A dark thought filled his head and he found himself coming a stop, Mavis's warnings to keep moving going completely unheard as his mind began to reach its conclusion. The odd look he had seen the old man wearing. That smile Zanjitsu had been showing just then, and the way he had acted when they first spoke earlier. That was a farewell. He was already spinning on his heel the moment the words left his mouth, prepared to sprint back as fast as he could when a single voice cut him off. "Wait." Mavis's words brought him to a halt before he could take a single step and he could feel her taking physical form again on his shoulder. Her grip however was tighter than he had ever felt it, almost as if she was afraid to let go of him. "Don't go back," Mavis whispered softly as she clung to him. "Please, don't do it." "Zanjitsu is back there," Ichigo replied simply. "I can't abandon him. He needs help. And you can help him as you are." Her gaze lifted slightly from his shoulder so that her chin now rested against it, looking down at his weaponless hands. "What hope do you have without a weapon? You still haven't recovered enough to the point where you can remake them. And if you go back now, you'll only get in the way of Zanjitsu's objective." "Which is?" Mavis clung to him even tighter before she forced her gaze to meet his own. "To die with a purpose." Her words left him speechless and Mavis wasted no time in taking advantage of his silence. "He was already fading when you spoke to him before. All I've done was honor his request and grant him an illusionary body that the last of his essence can inhabit. Whether the body fails first or the spirit does, in the end there is no saving the old man you call Zanjitsu anymore. He is already lost to you." Her grip on him slowly slacked before Mavis dropped down from his shoulder and let her feet touch the ground. Then, Taking one hand she slipped it into Ichigo's own and gave a slight tug to pull him away from the direction the fight was in. Please Ichigo. His last wish is to help you one last time. For the one who he loved so much, his only wish was that you could be saved even if meant his destruction. But that desire can only be realized if you run now. How can I leave him? Ichigo asked her weakly. He's been with me since the beginning. I can't just abandon him. I know you don't want to. I know you want to do nothing more than run back and tell him to flee with you. But trust me, that old man will still die no matter what you do now. His only salvation is in the damnation of another, and he refused to perform such an act. Because he couldn't, not after you accepted him despite everything he had done. If these are to be his final moments, please honor them by fleeing. He'll die, Ichigo muttered. Alone, against his original self. His greatest fear was the rain because it made him feel so lonesome, and now I'm meant to let him die without anyone who cares about him by his side. But he's not lonely, Mavis replied honestly, Ichigo making that first step to turn to look at her. She was smiling, but it wasn't really one that was meant to be from happiness or sadness. Rather it felt like it was uncertainty or maybe even jealously. I couldn't say those words, but he could. Because even if he falls and no one is there to watch, he said he would never be alone because he was fighting with the memories of all of us in his heart. You, the hollow side of you, even me, and your Edala's self. In the end, he said that he was a selfish man who was blessed to have so many memories with us despite his many failures in the beginning. That, while the time was short, it was still far more precious than anything in the world. Even his own life. Ichigo didn't say anything to her, instead turning away. She did however feel his grip tighten on her own, and she saw his other hand being raised to his eyes. It only lasted for a few seconds before Ichigo wiped away any tears he wanted to hide and turned back to her. All right, he said, the words he was saying sounding so hollow to her ears. We'll run. For his sake. Protector of the fairies. All right, Hibiki replied, glancing over briefly as another portal opened up and allowed Nozomi and those with her passage. I'll let the others know. Closing the connection, he turned his head towards the two teleporters standing nearby and reported, Ishine said he and Yuzu had already began heading for the Sun Gate, whatever that thing is, and are about to pass through it. They said the link was still set up with the Quincy battlefield? Ryukin was it? He turned to the older Quincy on the ship just in time to see the man nod. Is that safe? You don't know the situation over there, I see. As of right now, that place is safer than even the battlefield where the demons had taken. They will be safe there. It's why I told you to take the ship towards it. All right, we're taking a big risk here, but I'm trusting you. Turning back to Nozomi, he asked, can you get ready for moving the ship? We'll be relying on you here. Leave it to me, Nozomi replied, briefly glancing at those that she had brought on board with her. She couldn't hide the concern she was showing at those with her before she steeled her mind and turned away, rushing towards a quiet place so she could concentrate on her magic. Kisuke meanwhile rushed over to those that Nozomi had just brought back, his eyes locked on his old friend. Well, don't you look like crap, he stated as he began to grab the man carefully, lifting him onto his back before turning to Wendy, the young girl barely able to stay awake. If you can struggle on a bit longer, Miss Marvel, I could really use your help. We can probably find you something better to wear too on the way. Kelia. He paused at the sight of the still injured girl. She was healing, but it was still going to be a slow process with all the damage she appeared to have taken. As if seeing his concerns, Kelia shook her head before forcing herself to her feet. I can still help. The wince she made before she clutched her chest almost forced her to fall back down, clearly giving away her condition. All right, I'll sit this one out, she said in response to the looks sent her way. You sure you don't need me? One Sky Priestess will be enough for the time being, Kisuke replied kindly. In terms of medical experience, we also have Hades, so between the three of us we have enough hands available. Just focus on your own recovery. Let me help you, Miss Dogan offered to the younger girl, helping her over to one of the nearby chairs to rest in. Turning his head briefly to the other mage sitting nearby, he asked, are you sure you shouldn't go get some medical treatment, Gray? Gray shook his head, tapping his chest where ice still covered his wounds. I'll be fine for a bit longer. I'd rather stay on alert anyway until we're out of here. It's not like I'll die soon if nothing is done. It'll be helpful having you here just in case, Hibiki stated from his side of the room, glancing back at screens and frowning oddly. Huh? This is unusual. What is it? Multiple readings, Hibiki replied. Same people though. Is this part of the plan Uriah said Ichigo had? Is he using his Edala's self to throw my sensors off in his attempts to get away from Waiwak? No, that can't be right. This is different. What does it matter? Asked Mest, growing impatient the longer they were here. I can move to grab Ichigo and Uriah anytime, but I need their location. If not, I'll go and get Toshiro and Karen first. Do you have it? Kind of. Hibiki frowned again as he looked at the screen. Yeah, I'm sending you Toshiro and Karen's locations. Grab them quickly and get them to the medical bay rather than here. Karen is wounded, but Toshiro should be fine. Mest was gone the moment Hibiki finished speaking, the man sighing as he continued to stare at the screens. Is there a problem? Mist Ogden asked, walking closer to the man and peering at some of the screens curiously. If there's anything I can do. Nothing that can help us here, Hibiki replied, scratching his chin. Sorry, he added when his mind caught up with his words, realizing what he said could have been taken the wrong way. Just distracted here. I'm having a bit of a problem unraveling this. Is it Ichigo and Uriah's locations? As I said, kind of. I have their readings right now. Uriah is heading down towards where Wendy and Gildarts just were, while Ichigo is following not far behind from the look of it. I'm picking up an odd signature between him and Waiwak, and this one is confusing as the person is almost like a blend of those two magically. But then there are these odd signatures on the surface, heading to the Sun Gate. I've told Ishine already to leave the gate open if he can, and I've got a message from Uriah who said they are taking extreme methods and that we should leave the moment we are ready, regardless if they are on board or not. But that message. It's a bit contradictory to their first. Especially with Uriah heading towards his original destination. Maybe they'll climb up through the hole down there. Kelia suggested, getting weird looks in response. Yeah, we made a large hole up the surface. Kind of my fault, but Wendy is the one who sent the attack up there. Hibiki paused for a moment while looking at her before sighing. Questions for another time. Anyway, the moment Nozomi is ready and Mest is back on the ship with the others, we will leave. If this is what Uriah wants us to do, we have to have faith they can make it out after we're gone. If they're not back within 10 minutes afterwards Mist Ogden began to say, only for Hibiki to cut him off. We'll head right back, I know. I don't like this, but so long as Ichigo is here we should be able to leave. He better just hurry. I wouldn't want to be stuck in here with that army outside. Mist Ogden nodded. Same. That many Quincy would be too much for him to fight in his condition. Quincy. Hibiki raised an eyebrow before gesturing with one hand, bringing up a new screen to show the army surround Waiwaka's base. The Quincy army vanished not that long ago. These are the ones who moved in after they vanished. Is that? It can't be. It is, Hibiki replied gravely. I don't know why, but it seems Alvarez decided to join us today too. Protector of the Fairies. Strike after strike clashed against one another, neither giving any ground against the other. Arrows of various size shaped behind one and shot towards the other, but midway they were always intercepted by blades of varying sizes. And so the clash continued, and from a distance it might seem like the two were evenly matched. That, however, would be a lie. Zanjitsu knew it as he created and fired more blades to intercept the arrows he could feel being shaped far behind them, both to fire at his exposed back. While neither of them had yet to give any ground, he was the one who was going to end up falling first. Already his magical power was beginning to drop significantly. He was already at half of what he started with, and that was only going to drop faster the more Waiwak stepped up his attacks. What was more, than despite being a part of the man in front of him, their level of skill was obviously worlds apart. All he could do was react to Waiwaka's actions and keep the man in check for a bit longer. He couldn't press an assault because they lacked the power to break through this stalemate they were locked into. His only real advantage right now was his blades. For every arrow fired at him, a fake Zanpakuto intercepted it before it could reach the end of its journey. The easily made mass-produced arrows of Wywak were that bit weaker than his fake Zanpakuto, and that was enabling him to prevent the arrows from bombarding him from all sides. But unlike the arrows Wywak could make, the fake Zanpakuto were costly. They were draining away most of his power, while Wywak was free to fire arrows like this for days if he wished and still not get winded. Victory, however, was not his concern, at least. He could sense Ichigo on the move, slower than before, so he knew he only had to keep Wywak here for longer if he wanted to allow his master to escape. He had been worried when he had felt Ichigo stop for a time, even afraid that his master would come running back to his aid and ruin what little use he had left with this life, but luckily it appeared that Mavis had gotten through to him like she had promised him she would do if he found out. That would mean nothing if he couldn't buy enough time, however. Seeing how fast Wywak was right now, he had no doubts that it would take the Quincy very little time to catch up with Ichigo in his current state. Worst still, there could very well be shortcuts the Quincy King knew of to enable him to cut Ichigo off from his destination if by some chance he learned where he was going. So until he could feel Ichigo's presence meeting up with Uriuo, he had to keep fighting and hope this body would last long enough. Pushing back off the ground to make some distance between him and his original self, Zanjitsu narrowly dodged a set of new arrows that shot from behind him, their trajectories knocked off course by his own blades. He managed to get a few feet away before Wywak could make a pursuit, and, as his original self took that first step towards him, he changed tactics completely and charged straight at him. One of the many blades around him came to his hand as he swung, forcing Wywak on the defensive for a moment as he lashed out as fast as he could. More blades joined the battle, one for his other hand while the rest fired from all directions, but despite catching Wywak by surprise he wasn't able to even leave a single wound on the man. Each strike was blocked without a sign of unease on his opponent's face. "Is that really all a fake like you can do?" Wywak asked, his expression slightly showing more and more annoyance the longer the fight dragged on. "Stall me." "I'll do more than that," Zanjitsu replied, the cloak he wore around him glowing brightly before transforming into a state of pure energy. Tendrils whipped out and forced Wywak back further, grabbing new swords as they retracted back and leaving Zanjitsu armed with all his summoned blades. "I'll take you down." If anything, those words did get a reaction out of Wywak. Unfortunately, it was not the one he wanted. It was fury. "You dare lie!" he roared as he shot forward, his blade slashing through every blade that shot towards him to slow him down. Utilizing all the blades around him, Zanjitsu shot forward in turn and spun, every tendril of his cloak that was holding a sword slashing down at Wywak from every major direction. Unlike before, Wywak didn't block the blades with his sword. Rather, he let them slam against him, the blades shattering against his blood vein as he swung his sword up. Stuck in his spin, Zanjitsu could only try and move mid-flight when the blade tore across his back, leaving what would have been a major injury to anyone else. For him, in this illusionary body, it was still pretty fatal. His body restored itself as soon as he pulled back from his close proximity to Wywak, but the damage to his reserves was already done. Another hit like that. He couldn't take it. "Do you know why you're so disgusting to look at?" Wywak asked Zanjitsu as the spirit turned to face his original self. "It's the fact that a piece of myself is rebelling against me. You should have ensured Ichigo would be my most loyal soldier. You had better opportunities to do that than anyone else. And yet here you are, being the one affected and telling lies to me with my own face. It is disgusting to look at." "Then why don't you get rid of me already?" Zanjitsu asked, taunting the man as he tried to buy for more time. "You can't. Because we're the same still. I know how you think and how you fight, more so when you haven't evolved since the time you split me from you. You think we'll still the same? No, I'm not the same as someone who has grown as weak as you. I will never throw away a life as important as my own for the sake of another out of an emotion like love. Have you not even seen what you have become? You could have easily become a god, even as a copy of myself, and yet you seem content to play the role of a Zanpakuto. Why? Why?" Zanjitsu shrugged. "I doubt I could explain it in a way you could understand. I guess you're right. We aren't the same anymore. Indeed. You've bothered me long enough. You don't even deserve a worthy death." Raising his hand, Wywak gathered the energy once more to summon weapons to his side. Zanjitsu's eyes could only widen in shock when the energy formed blades instead of arrows, however, each a version of the many blades he had made so far. Those blades. I've seen enough of the ones you've been using to make my own copies. Besides, the technique to make them is now in my head thanks to you learning it. I have to at least congratulate you on such an impressive technique. Which is why I'll kill you with it. Stop it, Zanjitsu growled, the energy around him going wild as energy began to gather for his own creations. Those blades. They aren't yours. He roared, charging forward as a barrage of blades shot ahead of him. Each was intercepted by one of Waiwaka's own, point for point as a barrage of steel filled the air. For Zanjitsu, however, he only saw red. These weapons were all weapons he had made and shaped for Ichigo, testing them countless times in order to find a shape that was worthy to be the Zanpakuto he had once pretended to be. They were not meant for anyone else's hands. More blades joined the clash as he lost himself in the battle, the warnings in his head about how fast he was using up his magic being lost to him as he lost himself to rage. Pathetic, Waiwak stated as their clash continued, watching as Zanjitsu tried to push forward towards him. So driven by emotion and letting it rule your actions. You aren't even redeemable. More blades joined the clash from Waiwaka's side and immediately began to push Zanjitsu back. Despite the even matchup of the blades, Waiwaka's control was simply stronger. More and more blades appeared, beginning to outnumber Zanjitsu's own and leaving small cuts and gashes across his body as they broke through the gaps. For him, however, he couldn't even feel the pain. He just kept trying to push forward, using however much magic he needed. I said. He growled as he took another step through the storm of metal. Stop using those blades. With one final roar he broke through the last of the blades, swiping up with a sword towards Waiwak. His arm was severed by Waiwaka's own blade as his attack shattered against Waiwaka's skin, the Quincy King grabbing him by his neck and squeezing. As I said, pathetic. Pathetic. Zanjitsu chucked briefly before he was cut off by Waiwak squeezing harder. Trust me, that's you. His other hand moved and swung, the small blade that his form took as a Zanpakuto rushing through the air towards Waiwaka's neck. It was stopped millimeters from its target, his arm pieced by countless blades from above. Exactly. Pathetic. For a being like you, who takes so much pride in being a Zanpakuto, there was no doubt you would place all your hopes on the swing of your true blade. Throwing Zanjitsu away, Waiwak began to turn to head after Ichigo when he was forced to deflect another blade. You're not going anywhere, Zanjitsu growled out, struggling to stand. His body wasn't recovering at all, so he knew this had be it. One last push to keep Waiwak here, even if for only a few more seconds. I won't let you. With the last of his strength, he summoned blades around him. Rather than the odd mismatch of blades he had before, however, all of these blades were identical to the form of the Zanpakuto he represented. You're right. I was always going to rely on this blade. And if a mass amount of fakes won't do it, then how about a mass of the real thing? Every blade shot forward and met blades of Waiwaka's own. Unlike before, none of them failed. Rather, Waiwaka's blades were merely in the way to his own blades, each one breaking against the weight of the true Zanpakuto. Many more blades appeared at Waiwaka's side, but it was pointless when it came to stopping the blades, leaving Waiwak little choice but to deflect each blade with his own and rely on his instincts to dodge. Zanjitsu didn't let up, even as he felt his body beginning to fade. His left leg went first, the magic needed for more blades. Then went the right, leaving him hovering in the air. He couldn't move from this spot now, but that didn't matter. Another second. And then another. If he could claw away more and more time for Ichigo, it was all worth it. In the end, despite Waiwak beginning to press forward, the fight ended too suddenly. The last of the true Zanpakuto blades flew through the air before fading away before even reaching Waiwak, the last of Zanjitsu's energy spent and leaving only a floating head in the air, already transparent. Too bad, Zanjitsu said with a smile, even as a sword shot straight through his head and passed out the other side. You won't catch him now. Maybe it won't happen today, but I can promise you one thing. You'll lose. Just like before. I know this because I was once you, so I hope you'll prepared for that someday soon. Waiwak hadn't even stayed to listen, sprinting off in the direction Ichigo had gone. Zanjitsu could only let out a sigh as his head began to fade away, his thoughts drifting back to the one who had been his master for all these years. "Farewell Ichigo," he muttered fondly. "Farewell my old friend. Protector of the fairies. Fleeing to safety." "I sensed it too," replied Mavis, her gaze shifting down to the ground. "He'll be missed." "He'll be more than missed," Ichigo stated, picking up the pace as Mavis clung to his back once more. "He'll be avenged. But not today." "Not today," agreed Mavis. "Just focus on running. We're nearing Uriah, but, without the old man to hold back Waiwak, we'll be pushing it really close. Waiwak might catch up before we get there. Let's hope luck is on our side. We deserve some good fortune after all of this." Picking up speed, Ichigo sped round the next corner and rushed towards the end of the corridor. A few more turns and straights and they'd be at the jails. But with each step he could feel the ever-closing presence of the chasing Quincy. For every step he made, Waiwak must have made at least 3 or more. He was just turning the corner for the last straight when an arrow shot past his head, impacting against the wall beside him. "He's here," Mavis stated for him, Ichigo not daring to look behind as he ran for it. Fighting was not an option. Not in a situation where they were so outmatched like this. "Hurry. What do you think I'm doing?" Ichigo asked, feeling the spike of energy behind him that finally forced him look back. He wished he hadn't when he saw the entire corridor being filled by arrows, and without a blade there was no chance of deflecting them all. "Use me." And of course the moment he was in trouble he heard his Hollow's voice. The power of that side of Zanjitsu responded to his will as he threw his hand back, a crimson-red Zero charging in the palm of his hand. Arrows fired but the Zero stopped them all, taking advantage of the short confines of the space to consume all attacks in its path. It didn't even pose a threat to Waiwak however, the man slashing through it the second it reached him and continuing his pursuit. More arrows formed as Waiwak rushed forward but the Zero had served its purpose in buying Ichigo valuable time, allowing him just enough time to clear the end of the corridor and reach the cells. Uriah was waiting for him close to the entrance, obviously looking at the damage done and wondering what had caused it all. He would have done so too if not for the threat still pursuing him, so he did the only thing that he could. "Uriah!" Uriah spun at his call, seeing a hand being stretched out towards him. Instinctively he rushed forward to grab it, picking up on the urgency as quickly as Ichigo had wanted him to. Ichigo had only managed to grab Uriah by the time Waiwak appeared in the doorway, his gaze shifting all across the room for a brief moment. It was only for a moment, but that presented a moment that Waiwak had let his focus drift away from them, looking for any possible way they could escape. So when the golden light began to spring to life around Ichigo, he was slow to react. "Mavis. Do it now." Mavis nodded, raising a hand upwards as the golden light began to surround the 3 of them. As each particle of light met another, a golden shield of pure light began to appear around them. Waiwak recognized it immediately for what it was. Fairy Sphere, the ultimate defensive magic in all the world. At such a small level, the force packed into it would make it almost indestructible. However, even that didn't stop him as he lunged forward, a newfound sense of urgency in his eyes as they shifted once again. Additional pupils flashed into existence and the moment his hand touched the barrier, it almost shattered. "Mavis!" Ichigo shouted urgently, seeing Waiwaka's grip beginning to force its way through the shield. "Go! It's not safe. Without Fairy Sphere dash. We've got half of it, just go." Mavis gave him a brief look of concern, deaf to any protests or demands for answers from Uriah, before she nodded. "Hold on. I won't let you go," Waiwak declared, pushing his grip further as the light began to shine further. Pain filled his body as he forced one eye to close, but the other remained open defiantly, unwilling to let up from the state it was in as he tried to push forward. "You will not escape me. Now, Mavis." "I know," Mavis said before she stated 2 words. 2 words that made all their deaf to their surroundings as the light glowed brighter. "Lumen histo ire." "No." Waiwak roared, the shield before him finally shattered. His grip reached for Ichigo, but the Shinigami moved first, pushing forward from the ground and dragging with Uriah as he lunged forward. Space twisted all around them and Uriah found himself pushed against the remaining half of the golden shield, covered by Ichigo's body. His head however was free to see through the shield around him, hundreds of thousands of images flashing before his eyes for but a brief moment. He couldn't make sense of them, nor did he want to. So many scenes flashed before his eyes that they became incomprehensible to him. He must have seen scenes play out hundreds upon hundreds of times with only the slightest changes to them. Some he couldn't even tell the difference between them and the hundreds he saw before. His eyes felt like they were burning and before long he was forced to squeeze them shut to escape the pain. "You can open your eyes now, Uriah," he heard Mavis say, but he still took a few seconds to let the pain to go away before he did so. When he opened them, they were exactly where they had been before. There was no difference to it except for where they were lying, a few meters away from where they had started. Why whack! Uriah's arm snapped up, ready to create a weapon to fight with, when he froze at the sight at the doorway. Empty. It was completely empty, with no sign of the Quincy King in sight. He had vanished. What do you? He could barely voice his questions, looking at Mavis desperately for answers. Her attention however was locked on one individual instead, crouched beside Ichigo with one hand resting against his shoulder and trying to keep him steady. "It's fine, Ichigo," she whispered quietly, Uriah taking a step closer as he noticed Ichigo had barely moved from his position. "It'll fade. Just give it time. You'll be okay." "What's wrong with him?" Uriah asked, finally getting close enough to see past Mavis. He could see now why Ichigo wasn't moving from his position. He couldn't. It was like Ichigo had aged decades in mere moments, his usual orange hair dyed with streaks of white through it. Wrinkles were prominent on any surface of skin visible to him and muscles seemed to have deteriorated in a way that only age could cause. What happened? "The shield was important," Mavis muttered quietly. "It protects us. Without it, Ichigo knew the risks, so he made sure to shield you with his body. And this is the price." "Can he? He can recover, right?" Mavis nodded. "Instant restoration. It would have recognized the drastic change to his body and will already have begun the process of reversing it. But with the amount of work it will need to undo, he'll need time first for it to work. And we're short on it. Dreadfully short, in fact." "Why? I thought Ichigo had this escape route planned out." "He did," Mavis replied carefully. And then Wywak interfered. "We weren't. Gildarts and Wendy were meant to be here. But we had to rush and I couldn't risk keeping Ichigo in that place longer than I did. Going by the residual energy in the air, we must have missed them by a minute at most." "Missed them? What on earth?" Uriah froze as he looked around again. And then, as if to check his senses, he reached out for any incoming magical signatures. "Lumen Histo-Ire, this is what it is. I'll explain later, we need to move now. Find us a way out of here. We can't rely on the others picking us up now that we've messed up the timings." Turning back to Ichigo, Mavis focused on trying to pry open the shoulder pad Ichigo wore and to pull out the cloak from within. The moment it fell over Ichigo, all magical power leaving Ichigo's body to Uriah's senses vanished entirely, making him invisible to anyone sensing for him. "Hurry up." Reacting more promptly to her urgency, Uriah quickly began looking around. There wasn't much from what he could see, and he had looked around briefly when he first got there. The only possibility he could think of for escape was that hole, and with Ichigo in the state he was in, they'd have to risk it. They couldn't afford to take the long way back to the surface. Either they tried to sneak back up, which would be impossible with Ichigo, or they went straight up. And for this, he had just the technique that could get them up there. "Can he stand?" Uriah asked, getting a shake of the head in response. Sighing, he walked back over before leaning down and slinging one arm over his shoulders. He couldn't withhold the wince he made when he tried to support the two of them, almost dragging Ichigo forward towards the hole. "Come on," he muttered impatiently, trying to calm himself down. He wasn't even sure how conscious Ichigo was right now, his body appearing to be acting almost on autopilot but without the strength to support itself alone. But at least he could move. Having to carry him on his back would have been a difficult task with his strength. Finally making it over to the hole, he tapped his foot against the ground and allowed energy to gather into the shape of a disc beneath their feet. "Hang on tight," he muttered before the platform began to rise, making its way into the hole above. He took it slow at first. There was no need to rush things and make too much noise magically. Slow and steady would work, so long as they could make it in time. "Mavis, you said we can't contact the others?" he asked as the platform continued to rise, getting a nod in response from the girl. "Why?" "Well, more specifically, we can't rely on them. When I activated Lumen Histo-IR, they were still here. If the Genesis is still here when we escape Waiwaka's grasp and he senses us up there, he will shoot it down. The plan was to leave exactly as we vanished, taking us all away from Waiwaka's grasp. You said we were meant to meet up with Guildarts though. This power. I knew it was related to time magic, but this. I know." Uriu sighed, figuring that was all the response he'd get from her. "I see why you kept this so secret. Well, with this being the case, how much time do we have?" "Roughly, if you need to." 7 minutes and 38 seconds currently, Mavis stated. "I know the exact moment we left and the exact moment we will hit that point once again. So that brings me to our main issue. Are there any other methods of escape? We won't be able to do this again." "Other methods of escape?" "Well, there was one that was probably their best bet. The Sun Gate. Waiwak uses it to send his Sternritter all across the world. With him having been so focused on us, I doubt he has yet to retract my access privileges. If we can just make it to it, I can open up a path to anywhere we want or take any existing portal and hope we end up somewhere better where we can get reinforcements." "Let's hope we can make it then," Mavis replied. "Contact Hibiki once we reach the surface and let him know we're changing plans. If you can, find out where he is heading to so we can regroup if possible after using the Sun Gate. Right now our main objective is to escape Waiwaka's compound. If he follows us through, only a lot of brave mages will be able to save us then. Protector of the Fairies. Everyone's on board?" Hibiki asked, getting a nod from Mest as the man approached. "Good. Nozomi? How is it going?" "Another minute," she replied, her eyes still closed as she focused on her work. "I've got the coordinates locked in, but I still need to shape some magic to widen the portal." "As fast as you can, please," Hibiki responded, swiping away some of the screens to rid himself of unnecessary information. Sighing as his eyes rested on the one from Uriu, he quietly asked to himself, is this really the right decision? He didn't want to do this. Leaving anyone behind was something he hated to do. But both messages had stressed about timings. Uriu had stated that they had to go with or without them, so he could only lay his hopes on them reaching the Sun Gate. "Ishain?" he asked quietly, setting up a connection between him and the general. "You still reading me?" "Mostly," Ishain replied after a few moments. "Bit of static. Are you near the Sun Gate?" "Yep, and it's open." "That's probably causing some interference. Regardless, what is the status of you and Yuzu?" There was a pause for a moment in which he was sure Ishain was checking on his daughter. "She's fine for the most part. No real injuries, but she's not exactly willing to talk much right now, so I don't know what she's like emotionally." "Well, I have an idea of it all, but anyway, we're ready to step through the gate. Can you hold on for a bit longer?" Hibiki asked carefully. "I know it might be a bit dangerous, but Uriu and Ichigo are both heading to your position to use the gate. They failed to beat Waiwak, didn't they?" replied Ishain with a sigh. "Shit. I figured that was the reason for us to all be pulling out, but I had hoped that it was merely because reinforcements were arriving and we needed to regroup. Do you think you can hang on a bit?" Ishain let out a sigh. "Ishain. Sorry, just checking on Yuzu. I'll be a bit worried, but I think she'll be able to manage without me for a bit. Yuzu, go through the portal ahead of me. Don't worry, it's safe on the other side. Ryukin and I made sure of it." "Ryukin mentioned that too," Hibiki stated, hearing the words meant for Yuzu. "Why is that?" "The Quincy army should still be present." "Quincy army? Didn't encounter anything like that. Only quite a few Sternritter, and we made short work of them with a bit of help from some others. Right now there should be no one there." "No one?" Hibiki frowned. Had most of the army been withdrawn by Waiwak to surround the base earlier? No, that still didn't match up properly. That army had appeared there in the time it took to blink, and he was sure that wasn't normal teleportation. Not on that scale. Alright, we're putting a lot of faith in you here. Stay as long as you can, but don't be afraid to fall back if you feel like it's too dangerous. Ishain scoffed. And leave my son behind? If you wanted me to do that, then you shouldn't have told me. But then that was your intention. Best of luck to you all. And you. Cutting off the connection, Hibiki turned straight towards Nozomi. Ready. Done, Nozomi replied, opening her eyes. We'll ready anytime. Good. Use it now. We'll leaving. Protector of the Fairies. A bright flash of green light filled the sky for a moment, Uriah pausing to look up at the ship as it pulled away. Stabilizing in the air, a massive green portal remained present that the Genesis slowly began to fly into. It was leaving. Those 3 words filled him with a newfound sense of urgency, and he forced himself to move again. The courtyard they were crossing was completely empty, void of any signs of enemies around, and he was almost at the Sun Gate. He could even see what looked like Ishain in the distance, the man waving at them and beginning to rush to their side. However, with the ship leaving, he knew what that meant. Waiwak must have reached the jail cells by now and seen them vanish. If they could go up through the hole, he could too. And unlike him, Waiwak wasn't weighted down by the weight of another. Energy exploded up from the distance, and he knew that time had just happened. He doubted he had ever felt Waiwak release so much magical power, and the cause could only be rage. Rage directed at both of them and his fury at their attempts to escape. Give Ichigo to me, Ishain said quickly as he reached them both, Uriah needing no prompting to pass the man's son over to him. Slinging him across his back, Ishain turned back immediately and took off into a run, Uriah not far behind him. He couldn't help but keep glancing back, however, waiting for the danger he knew was coming. His wariness paid off when hundreds of arrows filled the sky in the distance, aimed towards them. Wait, not them, he realized with dread. The Sun Gate. His bow burst to life in his hands and he fired, countless arrows filling the sky in rapid succession. But for every arrow he was able to shoot down, 2 more replaced it. As fast as he was, Waiwaka's skill still surpassed his own by far. Honestly, is this all you can do? A female voice asked him suddenly, explosions bursting across the sky and destroying the remainder of Waiwaka's barrage. Coming to a stop in front of him, Bambietta gave him a smile as she gestured over her shoulder at Waiwak in the distance. Leave him to me. I'll hold him off. He knew what she was offering by saying that. And he didn't like it. But he also knew he wouldn't be able to drag her along too, so instead he settled for reaching out and pulling her into a hug. Thank you. For everything. Bambietta scoffed as she broke free, turning round to face Waiwak as she brushed the loose strands of her hair back over her shoulder. Don't thank me. I'm just a girl who wants to watch the world go down in fire. I'd either live past today or do something in the future that would cause you to hunt me down. She smiled again at that before adding more forcefully, go. I doubt I can hold him off for long. Goodbye then, Uriah said to her, turning and chasing after Ishain and Ichigo. Arrows burst to life behind him in greater force, but explosions across the sky took them all out before they could pass Bambietta, her glare focused to the Quincy King. Appearing before her with a burst of Hyrenkyaku, Waiwak had only one word for her. Move. Sorry, old geezer. You aren't getting past me. I said move, Waiwak stated, swinging his sword before Bambietta had time to blink. Her sword tried to make it, but she could already tell it wouldn't be fast enough to stop Waiwaka's blade from taking off her head. But the smirk she made didn't vanish. Right before Waiwaka's sword could make contact, an explosion tore apart the sword in the air beside her. A ringing sounded in her ears as she swung forward with her own sword, but it wasn't like she had expected it to reach Waiwak. He had already backed away the moment her explosion had begun, and now he had a new sword in his hands, his eyes glancing all around her to look for any more traps. Let me give you a clue, Bambietta stated, pointing down. Below. She didn't care that Waiwak had already began to move before her explosion triggered, ripping away the ground beneath his feet, and would have taken off his legs with it if she had gotten lucky. She had said she'd hold him off for a bit. And to that, she had to make him first see her as someone he couldn't ignore. Regardless of how dangerous that might be. She was almost there. He was watching her, but his gaze kept shifting to behind her too, monitoring how far the others were away from the sun gate. She could do this with one more strike, she was sure of it. But which card to play? Who was she kidding? She had hundreds. Raising her hand towards him, she made a show of putting her index and middle fingers together. Boom, she stated simply, snapping her fingers as the whole area around Wywak went up in smoke. With a swipe of Wywak's new blade it was all gone, but she could see the slight singes across his skin, protected from the brunt of the blast by his blood veneer. But with the way his eyes had narrowed at her, she knew she had succeeded in her goals. Gerald. Leal. She felt her blood freeze at the sound of those two names, two familiar and dangerous magical signatures appearing behind Wywak from the man's shadow. How long had they been there? How long had they been hiding for in the shadow of the base? After them. I shall deal with this traitor personally. As you wish, your majesty, replied Leal calmly, his one open eye examining the fleeing mages as they finally made it to the sun gate and entered into it. But what of the mages on the other side? They will outnumber us greatly. You will have all the power you need, Wywak responded as he let his sword fade away, bringing a hand to his chest before pulling it away. With it came a bundle of pure blue light, splitting in half and resting in the palm of both hands. Pillars of light shone down at the two Quincy behind him to their shock. For Bambietta, she could only watch in horror as their magical power rose to heights she hadn't even sensed before from the two Quincy. And they didn't appear to be stopping in their growth either. I have granted you both half of Jagram's soul. This should be more than enough power to fuel your evolution. Now go, Wywak stated to his two empowered Quincy. Finish off what little resistance remains and move on to the barrier. Destroy all that remains in your path and open up a path for me to follow through. As you wish, your majesty, stated Leal, both Quincy vanishing before Bambietta had time to blink. She could feel their presences arriving all the way at the sun gate and knew that they could have just as easily killed her in the time it took to do that. And yet they hadn't, leaving her here with Wywak alone. Somehow that made the situation even more terrifying to her. It appears you have finally realized the folly of your actions. Your death can be swift if you do one thing. Kneel. She was shaking. She could barely keep her blade straight and her arrogance was slipping away like dust through her fingertips. Buy time? This wasn't what she had believed buying time would be like. Not in the face of such overwhelming power. He took a step towards her and instinctively she shot back with Hirenkyaku, coming to a stop a few meters away as she tried to catch her breath. How disappointing. After all you've done for me over the years, I had expected more out of you in this betrayal than this. A sacred little girl ready to run away. I thought you already burnt away your fear in exchange for this self-destructive path of yours, but it appears I was wrong. Raising his hand, an arrow the size of a javelin appeared beside him in the air. Disappear. With barely a gesture from him, the arrow shot towards her. An energy-based attack like that was easy to destroy with the explode. She would merely have to touch the arrow with her own magic and boom. And yet she couldn't move her arms or her sword. She was frozen entirely in fear, not of the attack but of what could come after it. This arrow would kill her in one blow. Wasn't that a mercy in some cases? She had already allowed the others to escape like she wanted to, so what good was there in prolonging this? She knew it was going to end the exact same way, with her dying, so why delay it? And yet, I don't want to die, she whispered quietly to herself. Right now it was an impossible wish to be granted, but it still gave her strength. Her sword began to raise, but she could already tell it was too late. She had been too slow to find her resolve in the face of such fear. TCH. The unfamiliar sound appeared right by her ear, and the next moment had the massive arrow breaking apart into hundreds of pieces. At least you found your nerve, said the same voice, a woman stepping in front of her that she had seen before in reports. You're Alvarez's Valkyrie. Dimeria Yesta. That I am, Dimeria replied, shooting a grin towards Wywak as she noticed his eyes narrowing. Say, you said you wanted to live, right? Well, I have good news for you. You will. Because together with us, you're going to help us kill the old bastard over here. Us few. Oh yeah. Neinhard. Do it. Already done, came the reply from an effeminate-looking man, long purple hair pulled back into a ponytail. He was covered in a lot more armor than Dymeria was, covering most of his body, but unlike her he didn't look like he was used to fighting. The old man in front of him, however, that was another matter entirely. You. It was Waiwaka's reaction that shocked her the most, however, staring at the other man in disbelief. It's not possible. Is it really such a shock to see me again? The old man asked, his chest exposed from the rest of the outfit that he wore to reveal a body covered in hundreds of scars. How many battles had he been through to get all of those, she wondered. And how did he even appear so strong at that age? The old man had aged greatly, and yet his body didn't appear to have deteriorated like it did for most. The old man slowly raised his sword, nothing more than a charred blade in her eyes, before he spoke again. Let us continue where we left off all those years ago, Waiwak. History is not always doomed to repeat itself. Is that so? Waiwak spoke quietly, and for a moment his eyes appeared to soften. If only that was true, Yamamoto. My old friend, once again I'm afraid you must die. For the sake of the world and the peace we both sought. Protector of the fairies. My lord, a hollow spoke up to its king, Baragan looking down on it in boredom as he waited. We've managed to finish preparations for our assault. Should we begin? You're finally done. Baragan merely gave the hollow a wave of his hand as if to shoo it away. Go on then. Attack. Do as I commanded. My lord. The hollow remained in the room but couldn't help but take an uncertain step away when Baragan turned his full gaze towards it in annoyance. Are you not? I mean, is it really safe? Are you implying that I need you all to keep me safe? Choose your words carefully. It is only an annoyance to find someone else to relay the message, not a setback. Of course not, my lord. The hollow quickly exclaimed while shaking. Please accept my deepest apologizes, Lord B. Enough. Leave and do as I command. That is your only purpose, is it not? Baragan turned his gaze away from the hollow as it rushed out of the room as quickly as possible, resting back into his throne with an expression of pure boredom. Is something on your mind, Lord Baragan? A voice void of any emotion asked him from his side. Ulquiorra, his ever-loyal second-in-command, stood by his side ready to accept any command given to him. Whether it be to charge into an army by himself or fight against an impossible foe or even take his own life, he knew there was not a single command Ulquiorra wouldn't do if he gave it. It was what made him so helpful. If you desire the eliminate of the humans faster, I can always . That's not it, Baragan stated, turning back towards the door as if waiting for something. Have you ever felt like time moves slower the closer you get to something you are waiting for? Minutes can feel like hours as you desperately wish for time to move forward. I have been patient for so many years now, and finally I am feeling that impatience once again now that my revenge is nearing. I'm sure the elimination of the Ishgar's forces will be worth the wait. Again you miss it, Baragan explained calmly. You never asked about your missions over the years. Are not even the slightest bit curious of their true meanings. No, Ulquiorra replied simply. I have no reason to. Baragan let a small smile form at those words. I suppose I did pick you for that reason. All those missions have one thing in common, even when they failed. Information for my end goal. And that is the same thing I have always desired. My revenge. Whether humanity survives this war or I lose matters little to me. All I need is him to come here so I can get my revenge after all these years. Only when I see Ichigo Kurosaka losing everything the way I did can I truly be satisfied with it all. Glancing over at his loyal subordinate, he asked, Does it bother you that I care so little for whether all you hollows live or die? It is the nature of hollows for the strong to rule. Considering the lives of those below you is important. It is a strange human concept. I see little use for it. You are strong, therefore you rule. That is all there is to it. If someone desires another way, they merely have to challenge you and let the victor decide things from there. Baragan smiled again at the answer. A perfect answer like always. Be prepared, Ulquiorra. Very soon I will be making use of you to the fullest. Ichigo Kurosaki will come here, I know he will. And when that comes, I will have a very important mission for you. And that is, kill his friends and bring their corpses before him. I want to watch what expression he'll make when he sees his closest allies slaughtered before him and watch what he does next. Only then can I finally be satisfied. It is the very reason I sought out this power and clawed my way to the top. All for this coming day. Protector of the Fairies. Readings coming in, Hibiki said to the others, anxious eyes watching and waiting for his words. Ishine has reappeared close by and he has Ichigo and Uriah with him. Everyone is accounted for. Sighs of relief came out from those around him and he couldn't help but let one out himself. They had all managed to retreat safely and would be within the safe confines of the barrier in a few minutes' time. His smile slowly vanished however at the alerts that immediately began popping up on his archive screens, the happy atmosphere that had been starting to return shattering in an instant. Hibiki? Mist Ogden asked, a concerned frown across his face. What's happening? 2 incredibly high magical signatures, Hibiki muttered in concern. These readings, they're off the charts. Way beyond that of a normal human's. They're more like that of a dragon's or brace. No sooner had he screamed out the warning had a blast torn across the air beside them all, ripping open the wall of the ship and leaving nothing behind but a smooth cut. The ship however began to fall, crashing towards the ground uncontrollably as everyone tried to find grip on something to avoid being thrown around. Come on, Hibiki muttered as he clung to his desk, messing with archive screens with one hand as he tried to control their descent. They were crashing too fast and he couldn't stop it but he could at least aim them. What little power he could flood to the engines he did so, trying to slow the ship's descent while shoving the rest of the power into the ship's shields. Hold on! He screamed into a hastily made archive link, hoping he had warned everyone in time before they crashed. The ship fell nose first into the ground but Hibiki's work had done the trick by ensuring their angle had them skidding across the ground. The shields flickered and shattered as the ship slid further uncontrollably, the engines doing their best to continue to slow it down, until finally it crawled to a stop, only a few feet away from the barrier's edge. Hibiki let out a sigh of relief as he finally let go of the table he had been clinging to, looking at the screens in front of him for damage reports. Can everyone hear me? He asked, connecting everyone through archive magic. Kisuk, you and the others okay in the medical wing? Ow. Yeah, we'll fine, Kisuk said after a few moments of silence. Got thrown around a bit but nothing serious. What's the situation? Not sure yet. We took a hit from something and we must have lost engine power. I'm getting negative readings from the left engine in my archive system. I think I know the cause, stated Nozomi, peering out of the large hole across the side of the ship and looking back towards the way they had come from. There's no engine here. What? Hibiki abandoned his station to join her, his eyes widening in shock at the sight before him. I thought they had simply damaged the engine with some kind of attack. But this. No remains, Nozomi stated at the sight before them. Where had once been part of the ship was now a smooth cut across the left side, with everyone that had been present outside the ship missing entirely with no signs of any rubble or debris left in its place. Whoever did this is dangerous. You're telling me, Hibiki muttered, still in shock at the sight. No wonder it had been so hard to control the ship. It hadn't been able to remain in the air with only the engines of the right side supporting its weight. It was lucky they had been so far away from the barrier when they began to crash. If they had hit it with their kind of momentum. He didn't like what the consequences for them all would have been. Ichigo? Can you hear me? He's fine but not in the best condition to talk right now, stated Uriah in place of Ichigo. But if it helps, we found the source of your problems. Leo Baro and Gerald Valkyrie, 2 out of 4 of Waiwaka's elite guards. I thought he'd sent them away on missions of some kind but even so they definitely weren't capable of this kind of power beforehand. Their magical power is at levels unheard of in any other Quincy we've seen so far. Are they even human? Uriah paused for a moment before responding. You're sure that reading is accurate? Yes. Why? It's possible. Waiwak spoke once of making particular beings. His power enhances others and pushes them to newfound heights to realize their full potential. And he once said if used correctly, he might even be able to replicate the process in other humans that originally made the gods that we've heard of in the world. And you're saying he didn't want to hear it. Hearing it meant acknowledging the truth behind what was happening, and he didn't want to do that here. They can't be. They're not. I'm sorry. But our enemy right now are exactly what you fear they are. This kind of overwhelming firepower is found in very few beings. There is no doubt about what they are now. Gods. Protector of the fairies. They appeared, stated a silver-haired man, watching from the far distance on the edge of a cliff face. Hey Serena, what should we do? Move in. Not yet Jin, God Serena replied, crossing his arms under the cloak he wore as he stared into the distance. Observe first. I want to see how their light compares to my own in this bright sky. Jin scoffed. You and your dramatics. But that's fine with me. Let's just watch for now. See how well Ishgar can fight against Waiwaka's aces. I'm honestly surprised of how accurate he was with all of this. Scary, right? Our leader is wise. He has his ways to know that which is unseen. Still scary, Jin added, never losing his mocking smile as he spoke. I wouldn't want to get on his bad side. The things he's done and is doing, well, I'm impressed no one sees through him. Appearances are important for the main cast. And there you go again. You never get tired of it, do you? God Serena ignored Jin's remark, his gaze still locked onto the horizon. All right then, I'll drop it. His expression turning serious, he asked, there's no sign of acknowledger, right? He's been too quiet recently. Zeref has been keeping him quiet. Using up what little command he has over the beast to make it halt from making any moves. But that time is about to run out soon. Very shortly Acknowledger will make his move, and I fear this barrier won't stop him. What's this? Showing concern about others? That's not like you. I cannot win against him alone, God Serena reluctantly admitted. Acknowledger will undoubtedly go after the dragon slayers within the barrier first before trying to locate me. Even the star cannot always triumphant over adversary without his supporting cast, and they are mine. They are necessary. Well then, I suppose we better be quick here and hurry back to get ready. Beasts don't kill themselves and neither do gods. Let us watch how well Ishgar fares against them. And when they fail, we'll step in and steal the glory. You can hardly steal what is already yours, replied God Serena with an arrogant smile. Whether they be gods or merely Quincy pretending to be something they're not, it makes little difference to me. Because in the end, they are merely ants beneath my feet. Protector of the fairies. A plan to kill a king. What is that? Ishine's head shot towards Ichigo at the sound of his voice, the orange-haired Shinigami struggling to look behind him at the source of the disturbance. I sense something. Ignore it for now, Ichigo, Ishine stated as he continued to flee with his son on his back. Focus on conserving your energy. No. There's danger. Ichigo began struggling to break free of his father's grip, but in his weakened state all he managed to do was squirm around on the man's back. Let me go. When you have the energy to speak without pausing, then I'll let you go, Ishine shot back, glancing briefly back the way he had come from. In your state, it probably wouldn't be wise for you to try and fight those things. Whatever they are. You don't know. Ishine shrugged. I heard talk from the others about things like gods. Got people worried enough that Uriah told me to rush ahead. He'd said he'd be right behind us and after confirming it. You mean, he's holding them off? Yeah, Ishine admitted shamefully. I didn't want to leave him, but he made some arguments I couldn't deny. Right now we're hurrying to catch up with Yuzo. I can sense her ahead of us, and hopefully we can get inside the barrier before anything else happens. Though against this kind of power, I don't know how long the barrier might hold before they manage to break through. More squirming occurred on his back and he glanced back briefly to see Ichigo turning his head towards the energy in the distance. They aren't moving. Why? Ishine came to a stop at those words, frowning himself as he turned back. Yeah, you're right. Why did they stop? Uriah can't be holding them back by himself. No offense to the guy, but he's out of his league against them. What are they waiting for? Put me down. Quick. I told you, dash. Please. Just trust me. Letting out a sigh as he went against his better judgment, he slowly helped Ichigo off his back and onto his own feet. Ichigo struggled to stand for a moment, shaking as he tried to adjust his weight, before finally grabbing Ishine by the shoulder to stay standing. You see? You can't stand like this. I know. I'm improvising. Magic sparked to life in the air around his legs, slowly gathering around the two limbs and beginning to modify them. Armor as white as bone began to coat the surfaces, gaining sharp edges near the toes while the rest stretched up towards his ankles and continued all the way up to his waist. Carefully letting go of his father, Ichigo tested his weight on the legs briefly, moving from one to the other slowly until he was sure he could support himself. That should work, for now, he muttered slowly. It'll brace the legs. Help strengthen them, briefly. That'll be brittle, you know, Ishine pointed out. I heard you could modify your limbs to make them more like hollows. Bracing them isn't going to give you anywhere near the strength you're after. Too much magic required. Need to conserve it. More magic sparked to life, this time around his arms. Coating them in the same armor that the legs had, sharp claws left at the fingertips, Ichigo gave them a brief look over before nodding. Contact the others. They'll be able to think of something. Then, get Yuzue and run. And what will you be doing? Ishine asked suspiciously, his arms crossed as he stared at his son. Don't think for 1 second I'm willing to leave you out here in that state. Just because you've made your limbs able to move, doesn't mean you can fight. You're already ridiculously low on magical power, and I doubt you can even move at a fraction of your usual speed in the state you're in. I don't need to. I'll be bait. They chased us for me. Absolutely not. There was many things Ishine knew he could consider. Using family as bait was not one of them. If you aren't willing to leave, I'll drag you along with me. Don't think I can't easily restrain you in your current state. I'll do it. And what happens when they learn? I'm in the barrier. Ishine froze, the very scene he knew Ichigo wanted him to imagine flashing through his mind. There was no doubt these Quincy-turned gods wanted Ichigo. Waiwak wasn't willing to let them run without consequence. And if Ichigo made it into the barrier and the gods decided to ignore everything in their path to go after him and broke through, the amount of casualties would be immense. I'll keep them here. Get others to fight. Clenching his fists tightly, Ishine struggled against the urge to simply grab Ichigo there and then and run anyway. But it wasn't like they had many choices here. Slowly he managed to unclench his fists before spitting out a few words. Hakibi? That's your name, right? Is this thing still connected? Yeah, I'm here, Hibiki replied after a few moments. I left a channel open for you. You don't really have many ways to contact us without it, and considering the emergency. Well, a small breach of privacy is probably the least of your worries right now. I figured. You hear much of Ichigo's plan? The gist of it. He'll be the bait so that we can fight freely without too many casualties occurring as a result. Honestly, a big open space like this might be just the place we need to fight those two. I'm already gathering those of us with the required firepower to take them down. They're gods, right? So that means Sabertooth's Godslayer might come in handy if your teleporters can reach him in time. Nozomi's already on it, and I've sent out a message to all other generals asking for any aid they can provide. The number's small though. Godslayers are our most important asset for this battle right now, as raw power may not be enough in many cases. Alright then. I'm heading to catch up with Yuzu, and then I'll regroup with you lot at the Genesis. Or what remains of it at least. You can't get it operational, can you? Not in the time we have. Fall back for now. The gods haven't made a move yet, so we still have time to regroup before they do. Be warned though. Uriah said it looks like they are waiting because they want to adapt to their newfound power. Adapt? They took down the Genesis in one shot. How much more do they need to adapt? Considering the scale of power in that strike, I think they actually meant to hit the ship's main body and kill us all in one blow. We got lucky that it merely took us out of the sky instead, but that chance won't happen again once they adapt. Go, Ichigo stated from his hind's side, his gaze now locked on the horizon towards the way the two gods would come from. They'll be ready soon. Hurry. All right, I get it, Ishine replied reluctantly. I'm falling back, Hibiki. You have this position marked right. Perfectly. Tell Ichigo to not worry. Reinforcements will be there in no time at all. Protector of the fairies. There you are, Uriah muttered, watching from a distance as he observed the two Quincy-turned gods. Leo was immediately recognizable to him, even in the shocking new state. To his eyes the Quincy was almost like a massive centaur in body shape, with legs shaped into points, and it was towering over the ground to the point that he needed to stretch his neck back in order to see the head of the god at the top of its elongated neck. If its body was like a centaur, its neck was like a snake. Only its head retained some of its original human aspects, but even that was twisted by owl-like traits such as the beak and eyes. From the god's back were 8 wings, 4 on each side, with 3 large holes in each of them that spanned almost the full height of the wing itself. Its arms were ridiculously long too, with long bony fingers on each hand. One rested under the god's own chin as it turned a wing towards the ground in front of it. Pure white light gathered in the center of one of the wing's holes, gathering until the gap was completely filled, before it fired. The problem was that he didn't even see it travel through the air. All he saw was the moment that it impacted against the ground, leaving not even rubble behind in the crater the blast made. That power was definitely the X-axis. He found himself speaking quietly back to Hibiki as he reported some of his findings, all the while considering what he was witnessing. Before Leo had changed into this form, the X-axis had been an attack capable traveling at incredible speeds and smashing through any obstacle in the way of its objective. But now that he saw this, he realized it must have changed. Or rather, this was its full potential. Simply seeing the damage and knowing what it did to the Genesis, this kind of power appeared to have become one that eradicated anything in the path of its shot. It was not something people would be able to block easily, if at all, from the look of it. Then there was the fact that it had been fired from a hole in the god's wing. 3 holes in each wing, with a total of 8 wings, meant there was 24 holes that the energy could be fired from. They had to assume that Leo would be capable of firing all 24 blasts at once if they wanted to be sufficiently prepared. And that was ignoring the fact that the Quincy probably had other tricks hidden up his sleeves. His gaze then shifted to the other god present. One would have been tough enough to fight, and Gerald's presence just made things worse. In his human form, Gerald had been a muscular man that had worn a winged helmet and a red cape instead of a shirt. Now, a lot of that appearance still remained, only on a massive scale. The man had grown to heights even taller than his fellow god, with a large shield over his left hand and a massive sword with a star guard in his right. His helmet had broken away to let the man's hair flow back freely, a single metal plait covering his forehead, while a variety of markings now covered his exposed chest. And from the man's back stretched 2 feathery wings, over half as tall as the man was himself. Unlike Leo, who he had worked with before, he did not know Gerald's power. Waiwak had never told him, and he had never seen it in action. But whatever it had been promising enough for Waiwak to put him in his elite guard. There were many strong Quincy, but very few were on their level. With them it wasn't just about the power they possessed. It was that they were meant to be almost impossible to stop, according to Waiwak. I've got all I can, Uriah said quietly to Hibiki, beginning to back away. I'm heading back now. From the look of it, Leo has almost gotten the hang of his power. Gerald seems happy enough to wait for him, but that means he already has a grasp on his power. Do we have everyone yet? Nozomi's making one last stop, Hibiki replied back. I decided to do a quick check with Laxus, and he passed a message around that helped us find another set of hands. He offered coming himself, with all of Fairy Tail if necessary, but don't let them. We can manage raw firepower with those we have. Too many mages are simply going to cluster us up too much and create more appealing targets. What we need more than anything are those with god-slaying abilities. Speaking of which, is Kelia able to fight? She'll be fine according to her. Don't know how much truth there is to that, but do we really have the option to reject her? Uriah shook his head. Not at all. I'm heading back towards Ichigo and then I'll fall back to the ship afterwards. Are you sure there's nothing I can do to help while I'm here? You're our eyes on the battlefield. I've seen the kind of shots you pulled off from extreme ranges. I want you close by to report to me directly on the status of the battle. Sensors will only give me so much and I'll prefer visual data that can be properly verified if I can. I'll be counting on you to help me provide any valuable intel to the main fighters that you see, especially if you recognize any abilities or not. Alright, I'll be right over. Sparing one last glance, he noticed how at some point Leal had turned its head towards him. He was still extremely far in the distance but he knew the Quincy had seen him. Hibiki. Is Mest there? Yes. Why? Tell him to be ready. Teleport to me and back on my command. Ready. Telling him now. Uriah let Hibiki quickly talk as he continued to watch Leal, waiting for the Quincy to act. The gathering of energy would be his sign to flee but he couldn't do anything until it made a move. Doing otherwise would simply provoke. Light gathered faster than it had in all the tests Leal had done. He barely had time to scream out a warning when the energy was about to fire. His vision changed just as it finished luckily, finding himself back in the Genesis struggling to catch his breath. Thanks, he managed to get out after a few moments, shooting a thankful look towards Mest. Just in time. I almost didn't make it, Mest muttered, clutching his side. It was then Uriah noticed the blood, a large chunk of the man's side missing. He was wrong. Mest hadn't been just in time. He had been a moment too slow. Mest let out a chuckle awkwardly before falling forward, being caught by Uriah before he could hit the floor. Faster than I thought. Mest. Hibiki was over at the two in an instant, looking over the man urgently. Miss Doggin. Get him to Hades and Kisuk as fast as you can. Hurry. We don't need Hades in this battle. Uriah asked as Miss Doggin took Mest away, carrying the man carefully in his arms to avoid injuring the man further. He's powerful, right? Now enough raw output. His suppression abilities might have been helpful but we have two ice mages that can cover that well enough who would much prefer not having to worry about catching too many others in their attacks. Besides, with Hades and Kisuk working together we might be able to get Gildarts back on the battlefield if they can fit those limbs Kisuk's been working on for him. Do you think we have enough time? Judging by the attack, I'm no longer sure. But they're coming. We're out of time to prepare. Now we have to fight. Protector of the Fairies. Darting backwards, Waiwak didn't dare let the blade of Yamamoto reach him. Blocking it with his own blade would have been a foolish decision and would have only served to benefit his opponent more than himself. Arrows of light numbered in the hundreds filled the sky but upon making contact with Yamamoto they simply ceased to be. The man before him was like an unstoppable force, weathering through every attack sent towards him and attacking with strength so fearsome that it still frightened him even to this day. This was the very power that he remembered the Shinigami known as Genryusai Shijikuni Yamamoto possessing. The man's Bankai was one of the most dangerous powers he had ever encountered on this earth, taking any form of fire magic before it and putting it to shame. Even the legendary END was like a child before this power. Zanka no Tachi was its name. The long sword of the remnant flame. Like the man himself, it was a blade that looked so ancient compared to the flashy swords of today's era. Even the metal itself had become charred, scorched by the very flames it wielded. But he had learned long ago not to underestimate something based on its age. Even at such an old age when he awakened to his Ukin abilities, Yamamoto had still been one of the most fearsome of all Ukin he had ever laid eyes on. In his early days he had been a monster in battle, leaving none alive who dared challenge him, and even if age had caused him to soften his views he had still retained a lot of that strength. Eventually the man had become so strong that he had even tried to avoid fighting entirely, leaving matters to the many Shinigami he had drawn to his side. He had said that his power had become a curse to this land and that even his victory would now come at the cost of their own destruction. And he was right too. Magically there was no problems. As Nukin he could have sustained himself for a long period of time in battle. But the very heat his own Bankai generated caused all the moisture in the air to dry up. Nearby lakes would begin to evaporate and in some cases even those close to him would burn away entirely. No one was safe, not even the wielder of said power, because those flames would eventually consume everything in sight. It was what made this copy such a threat. He had never encountered this magic before, but he had seen similar ones from Gremmy. But even if it was fake, it didn't need the excess magic from being a Nookin to fight with his Bankai. The power it possessed alone would be enough to pose a significant threat. So as the sword swung at him once more, Yamamoto pressuring him back further, he made sure to not even try and block it and instead dodge. This Bankai, unlike the man's Shikai, didn't release flames. Instead it focused them all on the blade's edge and caused anything it cut to be eradicated. He was confident in the defense of his blood venet, but even that would not hold up against such concentrated power. This was the power of the technique Higashi, Kyokujitsujin, otherwise known as East, the Rising Sun Edge. Retaliating as well was extremely difficult because of the man's second technique, Nishi, Zanjitsu Gokui or West, Remnant Sun Prison Garb, as he had later learnt. Unless Yamamoto willed them to be seen, the coat of flames worn around the man wouldn't appear. Even when shown, he had realized it had merely been a representation made from the man's own magical power being released that resembled the intense heat. Like the blade's edge, it left nothing behind that touched it. At his prime he could handle this. And he still could if he pushed himself. But his power had yet to fully settle, awaking from its dormant state. Without the power of the Almighty, he possessed no way to bypass the flame barrier that wouldn't result in losing his own life in the process. So that meant changing targets to the source of this copy of Yamamoto. Neinhardt, one of Alvarez's top 12 mages. Even his intelligence reports on the man were vague, but not for a lack of trying. The man rarely got involved in battle, always using others to fight for him or instead utilizing wind magic to knock weaker enemies away. Now though he could see why his intelligence was lacking. The others Neinhardt made to fight for him were probably always personal to the user, many unknown enough in the world that his spies would never recognize them or what significance they have to the ones there would be fighting. But all magic had a limit. If Neinhardt was the summoner, it meant it was his magic that sustained Yamamoto in this world. Fighting his old friend was far harder to do than to simply get rid of the one that brought him to this fight. But then it wasn't like the woman that had arrived with him was stupid. Dimiria Yesta. He had understood what she was the moment he laid eyes on her. She was a vessel, hosting an entity he could not quite perceive so long as it was contained within her. But whatever being it was powerful. Powerful enough to grant her incredible power over time. With but a click of her teeth, time would freeze. If he had been another, he could have easily been killed during that time, but he had learned long ago the dangers of fighting a mage that could stop time. In order to safely combat Zeref, he had needed to discover a way to move in the frozen time and had learned just enough time magic of his own to allow himself to move once again. There was always a slight delay, however. Her activation speed was fast, and though his power was quick to work too, there was a brief moment between the two where she had a clear advantage. All he needed was a distance of a few steps and he could avoid anything of hers, but any closer and her attack would reach him first. And she abused that well, knowing that he couldn't take down Neinhardt with her there unless he got close too. He may have been able to move after all, but his arrows were another matter entirely, and she had taken great pleasure in shooting them down while time was frozen. Finally there was the pest that stopped him from merely retreating for a time and letting Neinhardt run out of magic and for the Yamamoto copy to fade away. Bambietta's attacks struck every time he moved around the battlefield, traps of all sizes littering the ground from what he reckoned was years of preparation. Learning where the best places would be to cause the most damage, working out how best to spread out her magic to engage in large-scale warfare against a single individual, this was not the work of a few weeks but of years of preparation for this one day. As it stood, he was unable to retreat nor able to safely advance. Before him stood an enemy he couldn't even harm, and behind him stood an enemy he could not reach unless he ignored the former. Such a combination was perfect to crushing him. It would crush him. Such a shame for them that he could see that. But he would not allow himself to be crushed. No matter how hard they struggled, his victory was never in debate here. All they could do was delay the future he sought from arriving. First he had to remove the pest to give him more breathing room. She had been hanging around to the left for a while now, having circled around him slowly, and the faint trails of magic left behind told him she had already trapped the area behind him. But where she was now was still a work in progress, and even the tiniest bit of pressure would force her focus to shift away from it. But with so many traps, she would still have time to get away. So instead he'd need something that could cut through them all with ease and draw her focus. His attacks wouldn't work, she could detonate them as easily as breathing, but another's would suffice. His blade spun in his hands before stabbing into the ground. Large quincy crosses sprouted from the ground all around him, with additional smaller crosses forming in the air all around the barrier as smaller shields. It would be pointless if Bambietta took it down while he was focusing on drawing Yamamoto in. He knew Yamamoto would recognize this technique too. Kirchen lied, Sankt-Zwinger was the ultimate defensive technique any Quincy could learn, and many probably didn't even know it existed anymore, the knowledge lost to time. But both of them knew. It would take an attack of immense strength to break through. And as he wanted, Yamamoto raised his blade and swung. Kita, Tenchi Kaijin, otherwise known as North, Heaven and Earth End in Ashes. It was a slash filled with the concentrated flames of the blade that would incinerate anything in its path. This barrier would be like air to such an attack, and he didn't have a single spell capable of stopping it in his arsenal. But what he did have was even greater. His eyes flickered their form once more. Right before the attack could reach him, it broke. Or at least part of it did, the area of the slash of flames that would have reached him vanishing. The rest continued along its path, faster than Bambietta ever expected when she realized part of the attack was still heading straight towards her. She discarded any thoughts but of dodging, but the moment she threw herself out of the way of one attack, she found a sword slicing down on her through her body. Wywak didn't even give her a second glance as he discarded the sword still stuck in her chest, her arm hanging limply to the side of the body he had cut down through. With the amount of blood she was losing, she'd be dead soon enough without him doing anything, and he had more pressing matters anyway. Yamamoto was on him in an instant, and he had to duck beneath a quick swipe to avoid being burnt to a crisp. He could feel the heat coming from Yamamoto burning his skin at such close proximity, but he needed to move forward, not back. So he shot forward, feeling flesh being stripped away by the heat as he passed far too close for comfort. The time it took Yamamoto to turn was time he used to close in on Neinhardt with frightening efficiency, preparing to kill the man with one blow to render him and his constructs useless. Like before, he found Dimeria blocking his path, her teeth beginning to slam against one another to trigger her time stop once again to gain that momentary advantage. It was such a shame for her that his eyes changed once more at the moment her teeth hit one another. Time didn't freeze for her, and for the first time in the fight he saw fear appear in her eyes. And without that brief advantage, she had no way to prevent him from passing her. Correction, he released as her eyes darkened, a massive storm of magical power erupting from her body. She had won. To release whatever had been hiding in her body to the surface and give it control. Seeing it with his eyes, he could immediately identify what it was. A god, one that controlled the flow of time. The body of the woman before him was coated completely in darkness, while her hair lengthened and stood up, held up by the force of her own magical power. Golden light burst to life across her body as markings, forming that of an old language not even his eyes could unravel through looking at it. This wasn't the same as one becoming a god. Rather, this was one that had been a god and had now taken to blessing and inhabiting humans to grant them power. It would only be able to maintain its presence in her body for a short period of time, and if he so desired he could wait it out again, like with Neinhardt. With Bambietta prevented from cutting off his escape routes long enough for Yamamoto to reach him, he had the freedom to do whatever he wished. But he didn't need to run. Nor did he want to. These foolish mages had invaded his base thinking they could kill him through a combination of their powers. It had been amusing to watch Ichigo and Uriah play their games, but he held no such emotion for this lot. They were merely pests that needed to be put in their place. Time began to stop once again, and he immediately went to work to halt it like he had done before. It failed, not that he had expected much else. Even his power had limits, and against a god of time there was no way he could prevent it from utilizing the one magic had specialized to such a degree. It still took time to re-enable his movements in the frozen space, the god getting closer to strike with every moment. But he was still far enough away that he had plenty of time. Time restored for him, but at the same moment it all unfroze. Not only did he have Yamamoto moving towards him from behind once again, but he also had this god striking at him from the front. He immediately knew which was the lesser of the two evils. The hand of the god slashed against him as he passed, merely catching his arm with a light cut from the energy wrapped around it. What he didn't expect was the immense pain he felt in that area, feeling almost like his arm had shattered multiple times at once. Yamamoto's blade was already swinging as he tried to recover, and he knew what strike was coming. That flame slash once again. Luckily he had all the time he needed to. Time froze before he even finished his thoughts. He could see blasts of energy being launched from the god, not one being aimed at him but rather the areas around him. Time restarted just as he would have been able to move once again, and he had little choice but to dart into the path of the beams, more than happy to take them head on then face the power of Yamamoto's attack. His eyes were still hurting and he wasn't even sure how many times he could use them in this fight without injury. Like the attack from the god before, all the blasts that hit him carried the same level of pain. Some even surpassed, and he noticed, blocking two against a hastily made sword. A bit of pain was more than worth it when he now had both of his most troublesome enemies on one side away from Neinhardt. The man was completely exposed, and as he shot towards the man he knew the mage was terrified of that fact too. Neinhardt tried to step back, slipping on uneven ground in his haste, and found a sword slicing down at him right before he could attempt to recover. Neither the god behind him nor Yamamoto could stop him from killing this mage now. His blade came to a stop more out of shock than anything else, however, when he felt a different kind of pain blossom through his body. Right before him was a man that he hadn't even known was there, hadn't even sensed, and had a dagger that was now shooting straight towards his chest. His hand moved fast, intending to grab the blade. He was too slow to stop it from sliding along his grip and into his chest. He could only glare at the assassin with pure hatred, with double pupil eyes, falling to his knees as immense pain filled his body. "It is done," said Jacob, leaving the blade in Waiwaka's chest as the man hit the ground. With a single look at the body he turned towards Dimeria, the woman exiting her god mode. "Exactly as you predicted." As Kronos predicted, Dimeria corrected, gripping her knees as she hunched over to rest. "I just borrowed his power and looked into the future." "Well, I'd say it worked out well," Neinhardt said happily, clapping his hands together as he got back to his feet and moved as far away from Waiwaka as he could. And his memory of this man was so incredible. "I feel like I should keep a hold of this and set him against Ishgar. What do you think, Mr. Shinigami?" Neinhardt paused at the sight of Yamamoto watching Waiwaka's body. "What, upset he's dead?" "He's not dead yet," Yamamoto replied calmly. "Finish the job if you intend to go through with it." "Finish the job." Jacob frowned as he turned back towards the body. By now it should have fallen to the ground, but Waiwaka still remained leaning against his knees on the ground, his body holding itself up straight. By this point his body should have begun to shut down. His heart is destroyed and he possesses no regenerative abilities of sufficient power to recover. "But I suppose it is best to finish these things quickly." "Wait," Dimeria stated, stopping Jacob as another knife appeared out of the sleeves of the man's coat and into his hand. "Something's wrong. He should have hit the ground by now." "What?" Neinhardt scoffed at her. "Sure you aren't forgetting things. You saw the future, remember?" "I did. And he was face first on the ground. We didn't even have this part of the conversation. We were talking about our victory for at least 10 more minutes. I made sure to be certain." "The answer is because your friend's blade broke," Waiwaka stated suddenly, one hand reaching up and pulling the blade from his chest. What came out, however, was a much shorter blade, his other hand opening to reveal pieces of the same blade clenched in his hand. "It unfortunately broke in two upon me grabbing it, and as a result the dagger you used lost the reach it needed to pierce my heart. Such a shame." "Not possible," Dimeria muttered in fear, taking a step back. "That's not possible. You were meant to die there. I saw it happen. That dagger never broke in the future I saw." "You are correct," Waiwaka admitted to her as he stood, discarding the pieces of the dagger at his feet as he turned to face them all. "You did kill me. Your plan was marvelous. But unfortunately I saw that occur." "What was this plan of yours?" "To enact a reenactment of events to ensure I would fall? I'm afraid to disappoint you, but you won't be able to kill me like that. I could lose hundreds of thousands of times, but I will always win so long as I win once." "Which means you will always lose." "Attack!" Neinhardt screamed, gesturing towards Waiwak as Yamamoto rushed forward. "Take him down now." "I'm afraid it's too late," Waiwak stated, closing one eye and leaving one eye with two pupils left open. "It's far too late." Yamamoto reached him and swung, but the strike came short when the blade being swung broke in two near the hilt, the longer half spinning through the air and missing Waiwak by a hair's breadth. While strong, I see now that this Yamamoto is significantly weaker than his true self. His Bankai's time has already hit its limit on the blade you conjured, and so it breaks so easily like this. Dealing with that cloak of flames, however, is such a pain, so I guess I'll have to do this the easy way. Before any could even ask what he meant by that, an arrow had already formed in the air behind Neinhardt and pierced straight into his skull. Yamamoto's attempts at a final lunge simply faded away with the Spriggan 12's death, leaving flickers of burns across Waiwaka's skin from the close proximity that immediately faded right afterwards. Turning his attention to Daimeria, he noticed she was already back in her god form and was rushing him. Time had stopped, but it would be back in a moment. In that time she would expect him to block or avoid her strikes. Unfortunately, he had no such intentions. Instead, he marched forward into the blasts, each one being deflected with ease as he closed the distance between the two of them. Time began to stop just as his hand reached for her neck, and she wasted no time in trying to take advantage of their close proximity. A sword formed in her hands, more like the hand of a clock than anything else, but it shattered the moment it hit his skin. Blood Vene. Such a useful ability, is it not? This time he didn't miss. Time stopped again, but his hand was already wrapped tightly around her throat. She lashed out as rapidly as she could, trying to force him to let go, but nothing worked. He just ignored all the pain like it wasn't there and didn't even make a move to enter her own frozen time, instead letting her choke to death in an unmoving world. Her god form was already vanishing when he finished the deed by crushing her neck completely, discarding her body as he looked around the battlefield. Where was the third mage from Alvarez? He had appeared without warning and hadn't even been picked up by his senses, so it meant the man must have an ability that rendered him invisible to him. There was nothing he could pick up from listening either, nor from any other sense. For all he knew, the assassin could be making a run for it. But he knew that the assassin wasn't. There were many possible futures where the assassin might have run. But this was not one of them. And if he stood as he was, it meant that the next attack would come from behind him to the right. It was near his sword, but that was intentional on the assassin's part to avoid his actions being easily predicted. But he had already seen it happen. So it was easy for him to deflect the sword with one swipe of his own at the exact moment the assassin struck and have the man's leg pierced by a spike of energy from the ground below, severing the limb entirely so that he couldn't flee. "Jacob, was it?" Waiwak asked, uncaring about the lack of response he got. "It appears you will be the least troublesome of the lot to test something with me. I hope you don't mind." "Go to dash. Hell? Thousands of futures and you say the same thing. You really shouldn't be so predictable." Before Jacob could even ask what he meant, Waiwaka's sword swung down at him, cutting across his chest. As it left, however, not a single mark remained in its place. It didn't stop Jacob's eyes from going blank, however, the man sitting there like an empty doll. "Fascinating," Waiwak stated as he began to walk away from the body, a single arrow forming in the air behind him and slamming into Jacob's head to finish him off. "Such an interesting technique you developed, Ichigo. The ability to grasp and steal the memories of those you target. And with Uriu's ability, I can store it even more efficiently than I ever could before and study it at my leisure. However, it appears this has confirmed a theory of mine about Zeref and Spriggan. How fascinating to see." Coming to a halt, Waiwak grabbing the side of his head as he forced his open eye shut, immense pain ripping across his body. He held in any sounds his body wanted to make, enduring the pain until it finally subsided. Each use was making the pain worse, and prolonged use only made it tougher for him to endure. But it wasn't like he had anything worry about now. Anyone left that even possessed the remote chance of being a threat to him was dead. But of course so was a lot of his most useful Quincy. Letting out a sigh, he began to walk towards the Sun Gate to check on the progress of the Quincy he sent ahead when a single voice stopped him. "Wait. Oh? You're still alive?" he asked curiously, looking towards Bambietta. His vision was slightly blurry, he noticed, but he chose to ignore it from the time in favor of her. She appeared to have pulled her wound closed with Ransutenge, a technique he hadn't even been aware she had learned, and was struggling to stand on shaking legs. You should have continued to pretend. I would have just ignored trash like you. Trash. Bambietta let out a laugh before raising a shaking finger towards him. Maybe I am to you. But are you sure you should be underestimating trash like me? My power is special, you know. A bluff, is it? Another trap or two. Wywak let his arms spread out as he gestured around him. Throw your best trap at me. Have you trapped the ground? The air? Do you have arrows ready to launch or a blast you've been prepared ready to be unleashed? What trump card do you have? My power is the ability to turn magic into bombs. But you know this. I insert my magic energy into the magic I want it to infect and convert it into bombs. Firing arrows that change into bombs, hiding coded energy in the ground with the energy ready to detonate, it's all fair game. And? Your point. Bambietta smiled, and for the first time that Wywak had ever seen her he felt uneasy. Who can take in magic, do they not? They absorb it into their bodies? From all around them, they take in the magic in the air. A Quincy merely gathers it for immediate use, but you've been ensuring you are never low on magic like all other Okin. So you probably never noticed which little bits of magic you took in. The unease on Wywaka's face changed to fury as he realized what she had done, his eyes changing as his blood burst to its strongest before Bambietta said one word to him, snapping her fingers as she did so. Boom. Protector of the Fairies. A clash against almighty gods. As the first step of the giant form of Gerald took place, he was met by a sweeping wave of ice from across the ground. For Leal it was a simple matter to leap into the sky, its set of wings holding it up as it observed from above. Gerald had no such advantage, however, his foot coming into contact with the frozen ground and finding it completely consuming him within its grasp. By the end all that remained of him was a giant statue of ice that shattered into pieces immediately afterwards. What little victory that could have been taken from such a sight vanished completely the moment what should have been nothing more than remains began to move, being drawn back up towards where Gerald's body had been and reforming it completely until not even a scratch was left behind, the only difference being the now faint glow to his skin. Gray scoffed at the sight in annoyance, crossing his arms briefly as he glanced over towards the others. The large ice barrier he had asked to be made behind him was slowly coming down, Toshiro allowing it to fade now that its purpose had been served. Looks like we really will need Godslayers to take these things down. Here I was hoping I could have frozen their magic away with my ice. They are gods for a reason, Toshiro stated calmly, glancing up briefly at the 3-4 petal flowers that hovered around his back. One was almost entirely gone now, with only one petal left, and it would still be some time until the other 2 flowers broke. Power isn't going to be enough here. And if your curse couldn't touch that giant, even when in your Aetherius form, it means the core of his power must be somewhere else. Somewhere your magic can't reach to. Doesn't make it any easier, Gray complained, cold air escaping his lips as he sighed and causing the nearby Ichigo to shiver. Sorry about the cold. I'd move a bit further away, but... His silence was more than enough for Ichigo to know what he meant. From Gray's perspective, right now in this fight he was someone that needed to be guarded. And considering his regeneration was still ongoing and he was finding it hard to move freely, that was a pretty fair assessment in his eyes. So long as you can contain them, that's all that matters for you both, Ichigo spoke quietly, glad he had managed to recover enough to speak clearly. Leave the god-slaying to the specialists. Where are they anyway? We don't have any more time to wait. Well, sorry we're late, spoke a gruff voice from behind them, Orga stepping out from a large green portal with others at his heel. The general of the forces nearby, Arcadios, was first to follow, dressed in his usual Sekizeki armor with his sword at his hip. Had to make a few stops apparently. We apologize for the delay, came the third voice, Urza appearing from within the portal alongside Nozomi. It took some time for Laxus to find me in the midst of battle. Urza? What are you doing here? Gray asked confusedly. It's good to see you again, but the time is a bit. I understand. Normally my assistance would have been unwarranted here. But when I heard the message from Hibiki, I decided I might have the ability to help. A few years back. She's got a god-slaying weapon, Nozomi summarized for them all, cutting Urza off. Sorry, we don't have much time. I'll be nearby if you all need me. Vanishing back into her portal, the green light vanished and left the others shooting questioning looks at Urza. She's half right, Urza stated. Letting the familiar magic of Requip appear in her hand, she summoned up the weapon in question to reveal it to them. From its appearance alone it didn't look like a true weapon but rather a ceremonial tool. Its end was flat and it lacked any edge to it. Alongside that, 4 diamonds were embedded in the blade's surface in a line while tassels hung from each side of the ornate guard it possessed, with 2 longer tassels connected at the hilt. It's called Shinken Hakyuken, Urza said in answer to their curious looks. Apparently it is capable of taking in the power of a god and splitting it off into 8 directions and that its power will always be determined by the god it is faced against. Apparently. Picked up Taoshiro. You don't know? No. This sword has not been used in battle in over 700 years according to the priest I received it from. They only parted with it after I protected their town from a siege of monsters for a week on end and completely rid them of the source of the attacks. I don't know how much truth there is to its legend but it was a cherished relic to the ones who had protected it for those centuries, enough so for them to try and retain as much knowledge of its history as they could. I of course informed Hibiki of the possibility that it held no power but he agreed with me that the risk is worth taking for the chance that it does hold some semblance of strength. Another god-slaying power would help us out, Ichigo muttered as he glanced towards Arcadios. I assume you are just planning to use that armor of yours. It worked pretty well on you, did it not? Arcadios joked in an attempt to lighten the mood. When it failed he settled for speaking frankly. Yes, this armor and sword are my weapons for this. I may not possess the ability to harm them with god-slaying magic nor do I possess the magical power you all share. But my body will break long before this armor fails me and this sword will not be stopped by any construct of magic. As one of the 2 generals of this battlefield, I could not prevent myself from lending my aid however small it might be. So long as you understand what you're getting yourself in for, Ichigo replied calmly as he took a quick look towards the approaching gods. This fight won't be like any you have been in before. I hope you understand that. Of course I do. Good. Ichigo turned his gaze upwards for a moment at the sight approaching them from the Genesis. Ah, here she is finally, he stated as Kelia came to a stop by them, hovering in the above. Alright, we have everyone we're getting for this fight. I'm only going to say this once so here's the plan. Ready? At the sign of 6 nods, Ichigo pointed towards himself. Right now they are chasing after me. They want me dead on Waiwaka's orders and they aren't going to back down easily. If the regeneration of that giant was anything to go by, they probably aren't even afraid of anything we can throw at them. Let's take advantage of that for our first strike while they too busy focusing on reaching me. Pointing at Kelia and Orga next, he continued with, you two are our main offensive force. We know your magic will have to have some sort of effect on them so take advantage of that. But remember that you two are the keys to this entire battle. If you both fall, we lose the only ones confirmed to have the capability of killing them. Next he pointed towards Taoshiro and Gray. You both are responsible for protecting our godslayers and keeping those Quincy suppressed. You can both make massive amounts of ice so make use of it. Don't be afraid to use everything you've got because against enemies like this you'll very well need to. Make sure to clear the way for Kelia and Orga to unleash their attacks. Finally he turned his hand towards Urza and Arcadios. You're both pretty much wild cards in this battle. Without absolute knowledge on whether that weapon will work or not, we can't yet count on it. When you get the chance give it a try Urza, but be careful. If you mess up and it doesn't work, none of us will be able to save you in time. If you can find a safe moment in the battle to do so dash. I'm willing to take the risk, Urza said as she cut in. And if I give away the secret of my weapon too early it'll put them on guard. If I'm going to test it, I'll do it at a moment when I'm sure I'll be able to deal a substantial blow if it works. Fair enough, it's your choice, Ichigo accepted before turning to Arcadios. Don't forget you are the weakest of us all Arcadios. That armor and sword may be strong but your body is far weaker. That armor won't protect you from the force of their attacks, only from the attack itself. Remember that I beat you before when you were wearing that armor and I was only using my Shikai. Forget that and you'll end up dead from overestimating your own capabilities. I understand, Arcadios replied. I know my limits. Good. Alright everyone, pick your targets wisely. If you can fly, I recommend picking off the one Uriah said was Leal. The flying one, I think. The rest focus on Gerald. You sure you'll be safe over here without protection? Toshiro asked, Ichigo giving him a nod in response. I'll be fine. If things really start taking a turn for the worse. Ichigo paused for a moment as he weighed up what he wanted to say. Finally he let out a sigh before saying, let them through. What? But Ichigo dash. Trust me. If things really do turn bad, let them through and I'll ensure an opening for you all. But if I do that, make sure you all take advantage of it. I won't be able to do it much. They're getting closer, Gray warned everyone as he took a few steps towards the gods. If anyone else has anything else to say, now's the time. We're fine here, Ichigo said after giving the others a moment to think. Take them down. I thought you'd never ask. Orga let out cheerfully, immediately rushing towards Gerald in the distance as lightning began to cover his form. Hey, wait the hell up! Shouted Gray as rushed in pursuit of the Godslayer, Arcadios following right behind him. Toshiro and Wendy both took to the skies as they split off from the others, Urza following after them a few moments later after switching armors, leaving Ichigo to watch the battle from afar. What do you think our chances are, Mavis? He asked quietly, the girl resting on his shoulder deep in thought. You haven't said a word yet. I think we have a chance. But it's still small. Gods are notoriously tricky beings to kill at the best of times, and these ones seem more troublesome than the ones I've heard of over the years. Not many gods are capable of regeneration on that scale. That is a problem in itself, but then we have the strength each possesses to consider on top of that. This won't be easy. Ichigo let out a sigh. No one said it would be, Mavis. All we can do is hope this is enough to stop them. Protector of the Fairies. Hundreds of shards of ice filled the air, raining down upon Leal only for them to pass straight through his body. The wings on Leal's back moved to face Toshiro the moment the wave of ice finished passing through him, energy gathering to fire right before he had to dodge the slashes of black wind from above. The energy that had been gathered fired, but dodging had put his aim off course and resulting in the blasts tearing through the air past Toshiro and destroying his left wing. Swords shot up at Leal from his blind spots, but they all passed straight through his body as they made contact, Kelia quickly having to dodge a few that soared too high towards her. At the same time Gerald was swinging his fist down at the ground, intending to crush Arcadios with his power in one blow. The general's sword swung up and tore through the arm like butter, however, as he dodged, leaving a large gash along the Quincy's wrist and disabling the fist for a moment. Taking advantage of the fact that Gerald had yet to regenerate from the damage, Gray struck first, leaping up higher towards the god on platforms of ice and letting out a steady stream of cold air at the whole limb as he went. Ice spread up from the wrist to the shoulder, coating it entirely before it shattered as Gerald pulled his body back, his arm left behind in the process. The remains were already beginning to reform, but in that time Orga used his lightning manifestation to throw bolts of lightning at the god, each tearing a hole through Gerald's other arm as the Quincy raised it in defense. Its power by the time it tore through, however, was greatly diminished, leaving only small burns against Gerald's chest upon impact. It was the Quincy's turn to retaliate in that moment. For Gerald, his good hand came up and slammed his sword straight down against the ground, creating a shockwave from the force and knocking the two fighters still on the ground back and putting them off guard. Leal's attention immediately turned towards them as they fell back, ignoring the mages around him in exchange for aiming all 24 holes towards them. Watch out! Urza shouted, raising her voice as loud as she could in the hopes they would hear it in time. Gray's gaze snapped towards her just in time to see the attacks charging, Toshiro and Kelia hastily trying to strike before Leal could. They would be too slow, he knew it, so all he could do was create the faster barrier he could. Ice spread from his palms in an instant and froze everything before him, stretching in all directions to form a massive ice wall between the two of them. That barrier didn't even hold back the blasts for a single second. The entire area below was blanked in a rain of destruction, not a single space being left safe from the destruction. Gray's gaze snapped towards his allies desperately before seeing Orga falling in the air, having barely leapt out of the way in time when the barrier came up. Arcadios was revealed only a moment later as the energy around his body cleared away, perfectly unharmed within his armor, much to his relief. He was happy the man hadn't been bluffing about the armor's power, as it was probably the only thing that had saved him there from the energy blasts. Leal's attack had its cost. A massive dragon of ice slammed down upon him, slices of wind focused and bundled together so that the attack took off one of the god's thin, bony arms. It wasn't enough to set him back though, a new arm rapidly growing out from where it had been severed from as a bright orb of light generated in his other hand. It quickly revealed itself to be a beam attack as it fired, Taoshiro's repaired wings slamming down over his body as it hit him and protecting him from the worst of the damage. Through the holes made in his broken ice, he immediately saw the sign of energy charging in the god's wings once more. There wasn't time for Leal to fire again, however, a small form coated in black wind darting through the sky and bouncing from side to side off the air around the god's body. Hundreds of small cuts quickly littered his giant body, courtesy of Kelia's magic, before she spun round at the end of her journey and released a massive breath attack directly upwards at him. The attack still missed though. Despite Leal's large form, he was surprisingly nimble in the air, his body's shape slowly altering to make himself more streamlined the longer the battle dragged on. So instead of being hit by the attack, Leal managed to dart away so that only one of his legs got a glancing blow against it. As Kelia tried to follow up with a second attack, she found herself sensing the air disturbances behind her and immediately dropped from the sky, barely missing the large sword that was about to swat her like a bug. Gerald, back at full strength, took another step forward and leapt up at Leal's enemies, his other hand stretching towards Taoshiro with the intent to crush him beneath his grip. Gray and Orga prepared to launch attacks to stop him, only to find Leal shooting through the air past Gerald and firing down upon them. Only reflexes managed to get them out of the way of Leal's aim in time, and even then some of them were too slow. Arcadios didn't even stand a chance, but his armor prevented the magic of the X-axis from breaching further. For Gray, he felt the blast tear away part of the skin of his right leg, but it was quickly frozen over before it could get any worse. Orga was the luckiest, his lightning manifestation having given him the extra push he needed to get out of the shot's range in time. They didn't even have time to rest, however. Leal's shots were already being prepared to fire once again, and they knew they couldn't dodge them all time after time. Luckily they didn't need to. Swords rained down from the sky at Leal from above, forcing the god to turn intangible for a moment to avoid the strikes. While the ability made fighting Leal difficult, it also meant it was able to be exploited to get him to use it. So long as that power was activate, Leal could not fire a single shot. Gerald immediately swung back at them, however, his sword bearing down on Urza as she raised her own sword in defense. To Gerald's eyes, the ceremonial sword was something that would simply shatter beneath his blade. Even Urza's own allies couldn't hide their worry as the blade bore down on her. But the moment the two blades made contact, Urza swung up in response to Gerald's own action, the larger blade shattered at the point of impact. Gerald frowned for a moment at the sight of the shattering blade fragments, a large chunk of his blade missing at one side, before laughing. Interesting. You have a strong blade there. His blade immediately rose once more before being swung down with even more force. Rather than taking it head on again, however, Urza swiftly dodged it, a large lightning hand shooting up beside her and gripping tightly onto the blade. Going up. Orga roared as he flung himself upwards, generating a large spear within the other hand of his lightning manifestation and bringing him arm back. Lightning God's divine spear. With a strong grip he threw his arm down and released the spear, letting it fly straight towards Gerald's face. Sensing the danger in taking such an attack head-on, Gerald wisely stepped back and tilted his body to one side, the lightning tearing past his face and leaving small cuts where it scrapped as it passed. Stepping away, however, put him right in the aim of Gray, however, ribbons of blood stabbing into his body with ice spikes at their ends and rapidly freezing his whole body where he stood. Kelia was already on the move to launch a decisive blow on him while he was trapped, only to halt, her eyes seeing the disturbance of magic and giving her enough time to kick back off the air and launch herself downwards. No sooner had she done so had beams of light torn straight through Gerald's body and filled the air where she had been. There hadn't even been a single bit of hesitation from Leal at shooting through his own ally, but they could see that there had been nothing for the Quincy to fear from doing that when even that damage was instantly repaired along with all the damage they had caused. "We're getting nowhere," Taoshiro muttered to Gray as he passed him in the air. "Should we focus one down for a bit?" We can't ignore the other with how dangerous they are, Gray replied, glancing at the breaking petals of Taoshiro's Bankai. He was down to one flower now and one petal of that had already broken. He didn't dare voice his question about it out loud though. Too many ears were listening and he didn't want everyone to hear a confirmation of how much time Taoshiro had left in his Bankai. But he was sure that when the last of those petals was broken, they would be a mage down. So long as there were two gods still standing, they could not afford to lose a key player this early in the fight. If they could just make an opening on one of them and strike them down. One of the Quincy had paused. Leo had his head turned away from them all, towards the direction where Ichigo was, and probably had his gaze on Ichigo himself from the look of it. What is he doing? They heard the Quincy say before they snapped back into action, Kelia attacking from above while Orga fired lightning up from below. Leo made to start to dodge, but Gerald stepped in for him, blocking the strikes from above with his left arm and allowing the wind to slice harmlessly into the shield. The lightning from below was quickly scattered by a burst of light from Leo's palm, right before twin vortexes of ice shot towards the two gods. While the two Quincy were busy fending off the ice, Leo allowing it to pass through him and Gerald doing his best to hold the storm back against his shield as the ice threatened to spread further across his body, Orga began to run, charging away as fast as he could from the two gods towards the way they had come from. "Orga! Where are you going?" Arcadios roared after him before lashing out rapidly at Gerald's ankle to cut the muscles, forcing the god down to one knee while Urza lunged down at him from above with her sword. Gerald's own came up to meet it, but the ceremonial blade still managed to cut halfway through the large blade itself. Ignoring them all, Orga continued to run before finally coming to a halt a good distance away from them all. "Send it over!" he roared cheerfully, a spark of light appearing in the distance briefly before a massive tone of blue lightning slammed straight into Orga. "Hey to number 88. Taoshiro said in realization. He recognized that Kita from the times he had seen Ichigo throw it around, which could only mean that attack had come from him. Seeing Orga standing before it and now beginning to devour it, he realized exactly what Ichigo had intended to do here to support them. He did this for Wendy once, Kelia spoke as she passed by close to him in the air. And I guess me too, but I was an accident in that case. He's got enough magic that he can pack it into the spell in such a way that we Slayers regard it as a feast. With an attack like that, he's probably trying to force Orga into God over Soul. Before their eyes they could see its effect, black lightning beginning to coat Orga completely before solid shapes began to form from that lightning. An elegant robe formed around his body, leaving the right side of his upper body exposed, while a small set of small spheres began to hover around his neck, lightning dancing between them as a chain. His hair had gone wilder with the disappearance of his headband, sparks of lightning flickering from their ends while other smaller bolts of lightning began to circle his major joints. Only at his right arm did it appear in mass, coating the hand to his elbow in lightning so dense that the limb couldn't even be seen. "Orga! Look out!" Gray thought his warning had come too late to reach Orga when Gerald broke free of the ice they had been trying to pin him down with and made a beeline for the saber-tooth mage. But right as his sword was about to slam down Orga, the man vanished in a storm of lightning. "Hey," Orga said as he reappeared right before Gerald's face, a smirk across his face as he drew his fist back. "Pay back, say bitch." Gerald kicked back just as the lightning exploded forth from Orga's fist, his shield coming up to block the shot only to shatter upon impact. His only choice was to weather through the blast, and so he dug in by pressed back on his back foot as he attempted to hold his ground. That was a mistake he realized too late. Having rushed to stop Orga, he hadn't given enough time yet for his ankle to recover from the constant punishment it had been undergoing from Arcadios. Weak as the man might have been, the strikes had served their purpose for a moment like this, and Orga found his footing failing him as his limb went loose. The lightning that was attacking from the front smashed straight into his chest while shards of ice and countless swords rained on him from behind. They couldn't press their advantage for very long. By pressuring Gerald, they had shifted too much away from Leo, and the Quincy wasn't slow to make use of that. 24 lights filled the sky and shot down at the mages, the blasts uncaring if they tore through Gerald himself to reach their targets. Orga's newfound speed saved him, vanishing as lightning and reappearing much further than he had initially intended to go to. Taoshiro wasn't as lucky at first glance when a blast tore a hole straight through him, completely destroying the lower half of his body, but to their relief the body immediately lost its color to reveal nothing but ice. He had managed to switch out at what must have been the last second and used his ice clone as a target for Leal to aim at instead of him. Out of all of them, however, Urza proved to be the unluckiest. One of the blasts slammed straight at her and only the sword she wielded kept it at bay, the blast reflecting in 8 directions upon impact with the blade. That did nothing for the force behind the blast, however, and in that brief moment Urza went straight from the sky to the ground. Erza. For a moment Gray lost his composure, letting out a roar at the sight of one of his friends falling and unleashing it straight against Leal. If breathing carefully through his fingers had allowed him to create a small snowstorm capable of freezing his enemies, this was more akin to a blizzard tearing apart everything before it and robbing the world of life. If only it hadn't been Leal that was his enemy, he was sure that would have ended it there and then. But like many times before, the Quincy merely turned his body intangible and allowed the cold air to flow right through where he had been. Seeing Kelia shooting down after Urza, he managed to calm himself down by knowing she was going to heal Urza from the damage she must have taken from her fall. Logically now he could see the damage this had all caused them. Kelia would be out of action briefly in trying to get Urza back into the fight, while Urza was probably unable to move very easily right now considering she hadn't just gotten back up with them already. That was 2 of their mages with god-slaying capabilities down at the moment, and even Orgaz's boost in power wouldn't make up for that by himself. Ichigo, you find to draw their attention? Gray hastily asked into the archive link. We need to give time for Kelia to heal Urza. Are you sure? Ichigo asked after a few moments. This will be the best opening I can make for you all. We can find others. Just draw their attention. All right. Be ready to chase them. Gray wanted to ask what he meant by that, but the spike in magical power answered his question. Both Gerald and Leal held off from continuing the assault to turn to look towards Ichigo in the distance, both feeling the same thing they all were. Gerald! Leal screamed in fear. Stop him now! Already on it! Roared Gerald as he tore across the ground, his body still trying to recover as he pushed himself past them all. Taoshiro and Orga were right on his tail when Ichigo's voice cut in again, this time as a warning. All of you, get away from Gerald. I don't want to catch you in this. Bearing down on Ichigo, Gerald dug his feet into the ground just before him as he raised his sword up. Looking down on Ichigo, he could see the Shinigami had managed to regain his swords at some point. Just seeing them now held meant that he couldn't allow Ichigo to have the time to unleash any kind of attack. Both of Ichigo's blades were being pressed together, and with the energy he was sensing, it would be too dangerous to risk taking it head on in case he had something up his sleeve. His sword swung down, but as it did he heard a single word. Bankai. A massive amount of energy was released, but it was still smaller in scale compared to every other time Ichigo had used his Bankai. Just seeing that sight filled Gerald with more confidence as he swung, certain that his strike would crush the Shinigami below without worry. And yet when his blade slammed into the small sphere of darkness that was surrounding Ichigo, he realized something was wrong when the energy wasn't scattered by the force of his blow and the shockwave it caused. That hurt. The energy began to move, being pulled inwards until none of it remained. His sword, he realized, had never actually hit the ground but rather was being held up, gripped by Ichigo's bare hand. The skin though had gotten far paler. Gone was the bone armor that had been wrapped around Ichigo's limbs, and instead the color remained across his very flesh. His left eye had changed so that the sclera was now black with the pupil turned yellow, just like it had always done when he had donned his hollow mask, with dark marks running down across the left side of his face and eye and towards the rest of his body. At the side of his head now also extended a long forward-pointing horn, appearing to be made up of the same material that a hollow's mask would be made from. It was the blade though that Gerald found himself focusing on. Gripped tightly within Ichigo's right hand was an alternate version of the larger of his Shikai blades at first glance, though perhaps slightly larger now that he took notice of it. The main difference was that the blade was now entirely white. The inner part of the blade, however, that had once been hollow, was now filled in and colored black, the handle of the blade continuing down from it while the larger part of the blade continued down as a guard for the grip. From the very end of the blade was a chain that looped back up to the top, attaching itself close to the point of the blade itself. There was only one thought though that remained in his mind at the sight of Ichigo's blade, held downwards towards the ground. This is not your Bankai. This is different from what you used to fight the dragons in Zeref. You're sure on that? Well, I wouldn't be too quick to call that fake. It certainly used the power of my Bankai. Staring up at the giant, Ichigo tightened his grip on his Bankai's sword as he spoke. But then I never really gave out the name of that power. This though. This is Tensou Zanjutsu. And this is what it's capable of. Gerald frowned at the sight before him. He could sense no magical power in front of him. Not a single drop. Was that just because Ichigo had used up what little he had to enter his Bankai? No, even managing to get into Bankai would mean nothing if he couldn't maintain it. If Ichigo really had no magical power left, then he would have left this form by now. Was this all a bluff of some kind? And, when had Ichigo's sword being raised upwards? The body of the giant split down the middle as his thoughts grounded to a halt, each half falling down to Ichigo's sides as he stared beyond the giant towards the distance. It wasn't just the giant that had been split. All the clouds in the sky had been parted, forced to the sides as if something had cut through them with great force. Leo was stuck looking at the sight in shock, barely registering the fact that the tips of his right wings had been sliced off. The others were no better, frozen at the sight before them. What are you waiting for? Ichigo roared, the two halves of Gerald's body beginning to be pulled upwards and losing all trace of their usual human aspects. Each time he had recovered, his body had glowed brighter and brighter, and this time he had finally thrown away the remains of his human self for faster recovery as energy. His head, as it began to join together, had become more like a helmet that had been fused to its body, a set of eye holes at the top with multiple indentations on each side, while on its back two large spikes were being to take shape. Even the material forms of his shield and sword were taking on a pure energy shape, the shield growing large enough to cover half his height while his sword compressed all its energy into the densest shape it could make. Orga managed to make it right before Gerald finished reforming, releasing the strongest attack he could with the time he had in the form of a breath attack. The vortex of lightning slammed against Gerald's back, managing to pierce into it and knock away some of the reforming energy, but it still wasn't enough. By the time he ended his attack, Gerald had almost fully reformed and was raising his sword back up to strike down at Ichigo once again. Taoshiro was there to try and stop him, swinging his own sword down from behind and releasing a large dragon of ice towards his target. It slammed into the god's back and began to spread ice across its body, hoping to lock up its limbs in time, but Gerald still swung his sword without any trouble. Ichigo's sword moved slowly for a moment, almost reaching its destination too late, before it settled in a guard to block the overhead blow. It was a far cry from the kind of speed and strength he had shown only moments before, but the strength remained when Gerald's blade hit his own. It was the god's own blade that cracked upon contact, unable to break through but still managing to force Ichigo to skid away from the blow's force. The wind picked up suddenly for all of them, and then immediately Gerald was being knocked back, Ichigo's fist smashing into his skull. His foot pressed down quickly against the falling giant, and then Ichigo was gone. At the same moment Gerald went from falling to being planted deeply into the ground with his head caved in, the force almost sending Orga flying from the shockwave as the Godslayer tried to dig into the ground to hold on. Something shot down from above right afterwards and tore a large hole straight through Gerald's leg where it landed. Standing there in the middle, Ichigo reached down toward Gerald, each action done with as much care and control as he could, before gripping the energy body of the god and throwing it back towards Lille. 24 beams of light tore through the air moments later, tearing apart Gerald's body as they all honed in one target. But when the dust cleared from the explosion, Ichigo remained standing there, shielded behind his large blade as cover from the blasts. "Is that enough time?" Ichigo asked through the archive link, breathing heavily as he tried to make as few movements as possible. "Urza and Kelia. Are they able to fight?" "Yeah," Gray responded quietly. "It looks all good on their end. But when you said you could create an opening, this is not quite what I imagined. Can't you just dash?" "He can't kill them," Kelia cut in. "Maybe Lille if he caught the Quincy off guard. His regeneration is limited to certain areas, which is why he uses his intangibility so much, but all the damage against Gerald is useless. He can destroy him but he can't kill him." "The girl's right," Orga added, joining in the conversation briefly. "This archive system is unnerving to use. How do you all put up with this?" "Not the time, Orga." "Yeah, you're right. But my point stands, Kelly is right. If cutting that bastard in half can't kill him, it means the only chance we have is with God-slaying magic or Urza's little blade. Hey Urza, can you lend it to him? That could make our lives a bit easier. I think it'll break in one swing if I did, Urza replied calmly, as if the sight that they had been witness to was an everyday occurrence to her. This blade is strong but it's still old. If someone swung it with that much force, I'm pretty sure the blade would break in the process even if it did take down the enemy. However, I do have an idea. We'll all ears right now, Toshiro stated, eyeing the recovering Gerald warily while Leal hovered nearby. The only reason he could think of that had made the other Quincy halt was that it didn't want to try and push its luck against them all alone while Ichigo was there. With attacks that fast and with that much range, if Leal activated his intangibility a second too late then he'd be dead. If you've got something, might as well try it. Not like any of us have any bright ideas. It's relatively simple. I need you to get that oversized bird to try and kill me. Protector of the fairies. Slayers that surpass their origin. The smoke slowly began to clear away around Waiwak, giving Bambietta her first clear look at the man. Despite her best attempts, he was still alive. Not even a single sign of damage was visible on the man besides the fact he was now clutching the area over his left eye, visibly in pain but definitely not from anything she had done. But she could at least pretend it was for the moment. Hurts, right? I bet it does. Not many people are even alive after I detonate a bomb within their body. You think this pain came from you? Waiwak asked furiously, settling a glare on her from his one exposed eye. Don't be absurd. You always did like to take credit for work far beyond your own capabilities, even when your own intervention was minor at most. The pathetic delusions of trash. Oh? Well, this trash got you good regardless. How did it feel? An explosion of energy going off within your body. It didn't, declared Waiwak, finally removing his hand from his head as the pain began to subside. Like all your attempts here today, like all the plans and ploys of those that decided to fight me, it all came to the same conclusion. Nothing. All you have achieved is a wasted attempt at trying to kill me in exchange for your own life. Wasted, huh? Bambietta shook her head, slowly moving one of her arms to point towards the sun gate. It was destroyed. Didn't notice in the moment, did you? I detonated 2 explosions. Now you can't follow after Uriah. And yet it is still a waste, Waiwak replied calmly. Leal and Gerald are more than enough to deal with the remains of Ichigo's forces. They ran to escape me and yet have foes on the tail that are dangerous in their own right. Why do you think I wasted my time with you and these dogs of Alvarez? Because I no longer had any need to rush. Not when those that dared stand against me will be slaughtered by the hands of my Quincy. Arrogant to the end I see, Bambietta noted. I suppose you might be right. Giving them a soul to evolve their powers rapidly, I dread to think what kind of monsters they are now. To get such high praise from you speaks of their strength, but I wonder what would happen if I made an opening for Uriah's friends to act on. What then? Is this a bluff? Waiwak asked, showing annoyance at her words and the tone she was trying to imply. Are you seriously trying to manipulate me here into being worried? Have you fallen so low in your attempts to kill me that you would now resort to trickery? Bambietta shrugged. I do whatever works. I don't care if it's noble or dishonorable, clean or dirty, right or wrong. Surely you know that by now. So long as I get what I want, I'm happy with that. Well, I am done with this farce. Do you have any last req-? Oh, that's interesting, Bambietta spoke suddenly, interrupting him much to his annoyance. You're hesitating. What? All emotion drained from Waiwaka's voice until it nothing more than that of a cold machine. You heard me. You're hesitating. Normally you wouldn't bother with that. You'd just strike me down without care. But you're actually delaying killing me right now. And? Bambietta shrugged. Oh, it's probably nothing. I mean, there's certainly no compassion in there. Nor is it to show off your arrogance, you'd be far more talkative here if that was the case. Are you? Yes, you are. I see it now. You're waiting for something. The gears slowly began to click for Bambietta. Oh. Oh. She couldn't help it. She laughed, clutching her sides while doing her best to keep her eyes on Wywak. My god, she managed to get out between bursts. You're actually afraid to attack me right now, aren't you? What was that? Wywak took a step towards her, but he paused from taking another the moment her laughter stopped. That's right. You're afraid. Not of me so much but my power. You've been on guard since that explosion, making sure not to draw in even a single drop of magical power. And while you're trying to hide it, there are flickers of it still on your face. Of pain. What caused that, I wonder? Bambietta asked, resting her chin against her hand as she looked at him curiously. You survived my explosion without a scratch or burn on you, and yet you were hurt in a place that I didn't expect. Of all places to be damaged, why your eye. I didn't cause that, but then I expected you to go boom. And honestly, this isn't the first time I've seen you do something like this recently. You survived what should have been your end multiple times already today when you fought those Alvarez mages. So what has changed from now to then? Wywak remained silent, not giving anything away to her. But she knew better than to look for anything. The mere fact he was trying this was a sign that she was on the right lines. I doubt this is the first time you did this before this fight too. I saw Ichigo and Uriah fighting you earlier in the sky and things were pretty even at the time. But they wouldn't have come here if they didn't believe they could beat you. You've used this same trick on them too. Is it possible you've hit your limit by overusing whatever power that is? Bambietta let a smile appear across her face. It wasn't one of joy from kindness or a smile from seeing a sight she liked. It was one of pure viciousness, as if having seen her prey lying before her and completely unable to stop her. My last strike must have done it, or you would have already moved against me. You know right now that you can't avoid another strike like that and don't know what other traps I have left. I'd go so far as to say that this is the first time in a long while that you are honestly uncertain. Am I right? Still no answer or emotion. Not that she expected anything less. But she knew now what he had to have been doing. The mechanics and laws behind it were unclear, but right now he was exposed because of it. One more strike like the last would finish him off. But he was being careful. And as much as she would love it, she had no traps around her left. Her last gamble had taken a lot of preparation, and now even that wouldn't work with him being aware she could do it. There was no technique left that she had that would get her out of here alive. So she abandoned that thought. It didn't matter anymore if she died, because it was the end result no matter what she did. If she was going to die regardless, then it opened up new avenues to take. She could very easily turn her entire body into a bomb and blow this whole place to kingdom come using her remaining magical power. She still had plenty left. She hadn't even used Volstandig yet, and Wywak had only taken her out of the fight earlier by giving her a critical wound. With what she had left, using herself as a bomb had potential. But it wouldn't work, her heart told her. There would be a brief sign and Wywak was more than capable of clearing the epic entree. Anything short of being right by him wouldn't kill him, and that was ignoring the possibility that he had a defensive barrier strong enough to block the blast that he could summon up at will. No, what she needed was a blast like before. One that struck internally, the one place Wywak could not guard from. So this is really it, she muttered softly before raising her hand. Wywak was on guard immediately, watching her and everywhere around her. He was looking for the trick, the trap, and so he didn't expect it when she shoved her hand deep into her own wound. It hurt. It hurt like hell, especially when she was making the wound worse by doing so. She could feel her own blood slipping through her fingers and out of the wound, but that honestly didn't matter to her at this point. She had what she needed. You know, it's funny, Bambietta spoke to Wywak, letting her smile soften as she began to picture what her life had been. As much as I hate you, you did let me run loose for the longest time, causing as much chaos as I wanted. A person like me would have never been able to live a normal life with these desires. I would have ended up locked away in some cell or dead on the streets after pissing off the wrong idiot. Uriah found me instead, brought me to you, and even if I had to pretend to be your loyal dog, a lot of it was still real. And if wasn't for your blood too, this wouldn't even be possible. My gift of blood to you was nothing special, Wywak spoke finally. Like all Quincy, you become an investment to me. While you live, your powers are strengthened and accelerated to their full potential, and in return I gain them when you finally die. There is no kindness in such an act, so do not pretend like there is otherwise. I suppose that's true, Bambietta admitted. At least in regards to me right now. There's kindness in it at least when you actually value the person, but I've seen plenty of times how long that kindness lasts upon failure. But regardless, you made this all possible. Both my power reaching its potential, and your demise. I know how it works, remember, Bambietta added, wiggling her fingers a bit in her wound to draw his attention to her blood. After drinking your blood, I gained a little bit of you in here. All Quincy who drink your blood become a part of you in that sense. Blood binds us all through bonds we can't even see. But aren't such bonds magical? Expression returned to Waiwaka's face, and this time it could only be described as pure fury. It didn't matter what he tried to do now because she knew it wouldn't be fast enough. For her, inserting her magic into the magic of others was as easy as breathing. With just a single touch it became her weapon, a bomb ready to destroy her enemy, but she doubted she had ever felt magic as complex as this. It was like a web spread across the world, a bomb that would tear through the lands to systematically target particular individuals. Sorry Waiwak, she spat out with a smirk. You lose. Protector of the Fairies. Leading the charge, Orga leapt through the air and shot forward as lightning, slamming straight against the large shield Gerald held and causing the giant to take a step back in response from the impact as he tried to regain his balance. Right before he could finalize it, a blur slammed straight into his chest, causing the giant to go soaring back through the air away from them all. That same blur was shooting away from Gerald in the same action, shooting straight into Leal and passing right through him. For Leal, dodging was essential. But while his intangibility protected him from Ichigo as he shot through him, it did no such thing for the black wind that tore down at him from above. Kelia, taking advantage of the Quincy's diverted focus, made sure to aim carefully for one of the Quincy's wings, her magic tearing straight into the flesh and slicing the wing off at its base. It was only one wing, however. Leal still had 7 more, but even taking one away robbed it of 1/8 of its total fire power. It even took an effect on Leal's flight itself, the Quincy shifting more to one side without realizing it with the imbalance in his wings. Such difficulties did not hold Leal back from unleashing his rage. His body turned so that the 7 wings were being directed towards her, each of the 21 holes remaining drawing in energy. Urza leapt in front of her in her flight armor as they fired, her sword up before her in defense and causing all the blasts to slam against its flat surface. The force still sent her flying back, and Kelia did her best to grab Urza to support her in the process. Both were still flung away, but this time they had all the sky to traverse rather than straight down to the ground. Leal didn't have another chance to strike, ice raining down on him from above from Taushiro and up from the ground from Grey. With both storms of ice cutting off any escape, he had little choice but to turn intangible to block the assault. In the moment he turned intangible, Orga was up by him in the sky, turning back from his lightning form, uncaring of all the ice that shot towards them all. All he saw was an opportunity as he brought his fist back. Lightning God's dash. He never got a chance to finish his strike when a fist slammed down on him from above, making him shot straight back down towards the ground. Only a momentary switch into lightning at the last moment prevented his bones from breaking under the force, his form slipping out through the cracks around Gerald's fist before any ice from above could catch him in edge of the blast zone. Gerald's fist was not so lucky, multiple holes appearing across the limb as ice slammed through it. But it didn't even bother Gerald. Such damage was reversed in seconds. That's why no one intended to try and give Gerald that time. Kelia shot down from the sky as fast as she could, surrounding herself with black wind as she turned herself into a miniature cyclone before slamming straight into his chest. His new form, composed entirely of energy, was even easier to break through, she found, passing from one side of the god's chest to the other, but she knew that even unleashing her magic within Gerald had not done nearly enough damage at that level. Leal had already turned towards them, both her and Orga still within his firing range, and was about to fire countless blasts down at them. The attack never came. At a last moment Leal suddenly tried to turn intangible, as if having sensed a nearby threat approaching. He had been right, but he had been far too slow. Another 2 wings ripped from his back from his right side this time as the blur passed. That same blur continued past them all until it slammed straight into the ground, leaving a crater in its mix as the object in question continued to skid across the ground uncontrollably. Gerald was chasing after the attacker before he had a chance to recover. His sword came up before swinging down at the one who had taken two more of his allies' wings before his sword halted upon impact with the attacker's own, the large form of Tensai Zanjutsu holding the giant sword back without difficulty. Appearing quickly before Gerald's face, Toshiro came to a halt in midair before slashing out with his sword, blinding the giant as a giant wave of ice left his sword and slammed into the giant's head. Immediately he fell back at Ichigo's command when Gerald reeled back, Ichigo waiting until he was sure his friend was clear before swinging. His swing didn't stop until his blade had gone past his head and reached his shoulders, the blow itself tearing Gerald down the middle once again and continuing on into the distance. It didn't harm Leal in his intangible form, the Quincy ignoring the danger of Ichigo for the moment to focus on the more pressing matter of the God-slayers that were surrounding him. Kelia had returned to the sky above him while Orga was darting around as lightning, forcing him to remain on the move to keep them from targeting him easily. It was not easy with 3 of his wings missing, his speed having dropped as a result, but he didn't need to flee for long. The moment he broke free of their attempts to circle him, he returned to normal, unleashing a wave of light from his hand to quickly force them back while he prepared his shots. Ice spread up to the sky before he could fire, blocking his sight for a moment. He still fired, tearing through the ice wall with ease, but the moment his sight had been blocked had provided them more than enough time to escape his sight. They knew just as well as he did that his shots would only hit where he was aiming and that if they couldn't be seen then he couldn't aim at them specifically. Which was why his second set of shots all focused towards one Godslayer. Kelia had a moment to show her shock before trying to dart down, slipping behind the remains of the ice wall for cover. Leal didn't care about it, firing all blasts anyway and blanketing the area she was hiding in to ensure he hit. He did, but not as much as he had wanted to. By sheer luck Kelia had barely managed to escape the blast by falling straight down but had been a moment too slow to escape the blast entirely. Her left leg was missing at her knee, the wound sealed shut by the same blast, but it was enough to fill her entire body with pain from the feeling. Leal turned his attention away from the falling blur, knowing it would take far too much time for her to regenerate that whole limb in the heat of battle. Instead he returned his attention briefly over towards Ichigo, Gerald's regenerated form blocking him from view. Despite the lack of risk, he turned intangible anyway and was happy he did so when Gerald's body suddenly came flying up at him and passed through him. Ichigo was still being carried by his own force and passed through with the giant, Leal turning back the moment they were through in an attempt to fire to take advantage of the opening. Lightning tore across his back instead, Orgari appearing midfall and pulling one wing from each side of with him as his lightning tore into the flesh that held them there. The shots went wild as Leal began to fall with the Godslayer, the one wing on his right side and 2 wings on his left unable to hold his mass up alone. Platforms of magic began to form beneath his feet to try and slow his fall, but his body continued to smash through them, finally crashing down into the ground below with his head snapping forward and hitting the ground. He came to his senses just in time to pull his head back before the blade of Arcadios took it off, releasing a blast of light from its mouth in an attempt to incinerate the man with its intensity. But the armor held strong as Arcadios turned away, making sure his face wasn't exposed to the blast. You pests dare harm a god this much? It was like something had snapped in Leal. Losing one wing had been bad. Losing more had damaged his pride further. But being forced from the sky like this, forced to be brought down to their level, it filled him with humiliation that quickly led to anger. Breaking away from them all, Leal shot across the ground as fast as his weakened state would allow, firing blasts randomly behind him to deter the others from following carelessly. Spinning back round at a fair distance away, he rose his hand up to the sky before a large trumpet began to form before him. "This will be the end of you heathens!" Leal screamed towards them, stretching his neck up towards the trumpet. "Perish by the sound of the world's end!" Rushing for cover, every mage in the potential blast zone tried to get away. Arcadios settled for simply turning his back towards the blast, knowing he couldn't run even if he tried and trusting that his armor would keep him safe. Ichigo meanwhile shot off into the distance, gone in the time it took to blink and leaving only a shockwave from where he had been standing over Gerald. The others merely bundled together however, Kelia being lifted up by Orga with one arm of hers slung over his shoulder while her leg began to regenerate, with Urza standing before them all with her sword in grey and Toshiro behind her as support. With the loud sound of a trumpet, the world before them was engulfed in light. It tore across the ground and ripped it to shreds in the process, carving its way through it while stretching up the sky. It wasted little time in reaching them and shooting past, almost making it all the way to the Genesis and the barrier and only falling short by a few inches from the former. As the blast cleared though, Leo felt nothing but pain. His gaze slowly shifted down his body to see the massive cut going down it, from top to bottom, before all that began to break apart too. His gaze snapped back up towards the magical powers he could still sense only to find a long stretch of land untouched by his magic, starting from where Urza stood with her sword held up like she had swung it. It took only a few more seconds for the rest of Leo's body to break apart with the rest of him, not even a word of defiance coming from his mouth. To them, it was almost like the Quincy himself couldn't believe what was happening and was struggling to come to terms with it all. All that remained was the scattering particles of light, raining down all across the battlefield. "One down," Orga said with a wide smile. "1 2. He paused at the sight of Gerald reforming above them. The giant must have begun to rush them before Leo had attacked and was now recovering from that destruction. "Go. Move." Gerald's sword swung first, Gray leaping up towards it in desperation and raising his hand up towards it. The ribbons around him shot up and slammed into the sword, beginning to freeze it solid, but the momentum behind it was still too fast. All he could do in time was dull the edge with ice before it slammed down against them. While the others managed to get away in time thanks to those actions, Gray was not so lucky, unable to move from his position in the ground. He had felt something break from that attack and the pain was too much to allow him to focus on anything else. Before any follow-up attack could come, Gerald was knocked away by a massive dragon of ice, slamming into his shield and causing him to fall back from the continuous flow of ice. Toshiro landed by Gray's position, Orga and Kelia slowly splitting up to get positions around the god. "How you looking?" Toshiro asked quickly. "Need Kelia's help." "It'll take too long," Gray groaned in response, slowly getting used to the pain. "Hurry up and finish this before you run out of time and they lose both of their supports. Quickly." "Run out of time?" Toshiro frowned before glancing up at the last remaining petal of his Bankai. With the rate it was crumbling, it would be gone in mere moments. "It's fine," he stated to Gray's worried looks. "That's a countdown but not for what you thought." Stepping away from the body, Toshiro made sure he was between Gray and Gerald before beginning to approach the giant. "We'll finish this quickly now." The last petal broke, and with it a dam of power crumbled. All the ice that surrounded Toshiro simply fell away. Even the wings that had been used to accelerate his speed in flight were no exception, leaving only small layers of ice covering shoulders, forearms, and knees. Only a moment later did the others begin to realize that it was starting to snow, small flakes of it falling from newly gathered clouds in the sky. Piece by piece the snow began to fall until a steady stream of it was falling all around them. "You should have just asked if you were worried," Toshiro said to Gray softly as he looked around at the falling snow. "My Bankai merely requires a bit of time to wake up. Once the last petal falls, I become capable of utilizing the full power of my abilities. It takes a while to unleash, which is why I try not to rely on it too much, but if the fight lasts long enough then the results are generally worth it." "This snow is your doing, isn't it?" Gray asked, an odd feeling hitting him as each bit of snow fell on him. "You caused this?" Toshiro merely nodded to respond. "My Bankai, no, my Zanpakuto in general has always operated on the principle of manipulating the weather at its peak. But I'll admit I'm not capable of anything like this outside of my Bankai's true state. When I'm like this, it just begins to snow. It's almost like I'm looking at a memory from my childhood." Toshiro glanced around for a moment, having to blink a few times at the scenery before letting out a sad sigh. Finally he returned his attention back to Gerald, the giant being held back for the moment by the others despite his attempts to try and break past them. "Will you be fine here? Go on already. Finish this. The pesky one is out of the way anyway. You should be able to suppress this one by yourself." Leaping into the air, Toshiro quickly took off towards Gerald. The giant saw his approach and quickly swung out with his sword, Toshiro swiftly ducking underneath before letting his palm touch the side of the blade. A touch was all it took for the weapon to freeze, ice encouraging across its surface for the brief moment Toshiro's hand remained in contact with it. Urza was immediately following up on his attack with her own sword, slamming it down against the frozen area of the sword and shattering the blade at that point before it could recover at all like Gerald did. Orga stuck with Kelia at the same time, black wind and lightning fusing together in the storm they unleashed against Gerald from his other side. The shield he wore shattered to pieces against the combined assault and he immediately made to leap back. That would have worked if he hadn't forgotten about Arcadios. The man knew when to strike and the moment he saw the giant begin to move he severed the tendons of Gerald's ankle once again. Even so, 1 foot was more than enough power for Gerald to use to push back off and clear away from them. His sword came back as he tried to come to a halt, his ankle recovering ready for his charge, when Ichigo suddenly slammed into him from the distance and tore through the giant sword and towards his head. His blade slashed through the air and Gerald's head came clean off as Ichigo sailed through, skidding across the air as one hand tried to grip it for balance. The moment he did he was gone, soaring upwards over Gerald and into the clouds. Toshiro stepped in before Gerald could finish recovering, the giant's head beginning to be pulled back into place. He counted it out carefully, the precious seconds he needed passing slowly to his ears, until finally 4 seconds had passed. Gerald had finished recovering but it didn't stop him from uttering 2 words. Shikai Hyukatsu. Everything before him froze. The landscape that had already been beaten and bruised became covered in ice and Gerald was no exception. The giant was frozen completely solid, unable to even move a muscle. And yet he knew that hadn't killed the god. It wouldn't have, not when nothing else he had done so far had worked. But all he needed was the moment. Ichigo came down from the sky, slamming straight into the ice giant and shattering it into pieces. Shattering the ice had only hastened Gerald's recovery one could say, but it had also had the result of requiring the giant to completely reform rather than having the ice across his body slowly vanishing. The pieces began to be pulled back together, starting from the ground up with piece by piece moving into place. Both Toshiro and Ichigo let it happen, neither making a move to stop it despite their close proximities. Instead they just watched, the god slayers behind Toshiro using the time to gather up all the magical power they needed to finish it. Briefly glancing over his shoulder at them, Toshiro gave them all the encouragement they needed. "And this?" "With pleasure," Orga said, his form currently an odd mix of lightning and human. His lower half seemed to have been the only part of him that had switched and was providing him the necessary thrust to remain in the air while his human half had his arm outstretched up, a large mass of black lightning being gathered and shaped into one large thunderbolt. "Time to do our job." The 2 god slayers shot forward as fast as they could, Gerald managing to finish recovering just in time to face their charge. Wings burst out from his back and sent him rocketing forward fast enough that they were sure they would have failed to react in time at such close proximity. That would have been the case if not for the sudden explosion that took place from within Gerald's body, rupturing his chest and forcing the energy within to spiral out dangerously. Similar smaller explosions were taking place all around the ground, causing many of the grounded mages to try and avoid the blasts or weather through them, but for the godslayers in the sky they had no such luxury with Gerald in front of them. The signs of his regeneration were already kicking in. So both braved the storm of energy, emerging through it better than they expected with a direct line towards Gerald. Both brought hands back, one holding lighting while 2 others held black wind. Godslayer's secret art. Both roared, swinging their hands forward. Heavenly gathering of clouds. Heavenly storm of the skies. Both wind and lighting tore into Gerald. The wind left spared nothing in its path, cutting every part of him in sight that was caught in the spiraling mess of black wind. The lightning meanwhile only cared about what was right before it, tearing its way through Gerald from the angle Orga had fired it from so that it went from his head down through his body. They couldn't leave anything to chance, unaware of where the core of the god's magic might be and settling for using raw power to finish the job. No matter how well it was hidden, it would not be able to hide from their magic. Ichigo's strikes had been unable to touch it, Toshiro's and Gray's ice had been unable to freeze it, but their magic was the one magic it could not escape from. What was Gerald's body broke apart into a mass of energy, scattering all around them as the final bits of Godslayer magic finished its work. This time no recovery occurred. The energy remained scattered and Gerald did not recover. All that was left was a set of tired mages, slowly dropping from the sky from sheer exhaustion. "I've got you," Toshiro said as he grabbed Orga mid-fall, the man's god oversoul having vanished from his body now that the last drops of magic that he had left were drained. Kelia was in a similar state, held by Urza as she helped her down to the ground. When they managed to reach the ground they found Ichigo waiting for them there, leaning against his sword that he had stabbed into the ground as a crutch. While on the surface he looked to be fine, Toshiro noticed the winces he was trying to hide as he breathed. He didn't ask for the time being though, tired enough himself. He felt the fatigue the moment he let his Bankai disappear, the strain he had put his body under from utilizing so much magic so suddenly catching up to him. There was still the matter of Gray to check up on though. Turning his head he saw Arcadios carrying the mage on his shoulder, his armor protecting him from Gray's curse. Like the rest of them Gray appeared to have run out of steam too considering he had left his Aetherius form. The only ones who still appeared to be in fighting condition seemed to be Ichigo and Urza, the former having to lean on his Bankai's large sword with the latter looking still sore after having to block and reflect Leel's final attack. "Looks like we're all in one piece, huh?" Ichigo said jokingly, Orga letting out a laugh as he raised his fist up. "Better than that I'd say. Never thought I'd see the day where I'd get to fight a god, let alone two at once. I owe you all for this, no matter what anyone else says. Even if the battle itself was the toughest I've ever found myself in." "It was a tough-fought battle," Urza commented as she turned towards Orga. "Nonetheless, we achieved victory together. Without your assistance this battle could have turned out very differently. Our guilds may have their differences but I think I can speak for the majority of Fairy Tail when I say that we would be proud to fight alongside mages like you in the future. Does anyone need healing?" Kelia asked, turning to Gray in particular. "I saw you take a big hit but I didn't know what to do at the time and Orga said to stick with him for the moment. Are you alright Gray?" "Some stuff is probably broken but I'll live," Gray replied as he tried to put up a smile. "It might be easier for you to heal me on the ship when you've had a chance to regain at least some of the magic you've just spent though. I doubt you can heal me up right now." "I can't believe we did it," muttered Arcadios. "Gods. We beat gods. 2 of them. We'll have to spread these news around. The moral the troops could get from hearing such a feat would be desperately needed I feel. And there is no victory more inspiring than utter domination. Unforgivable." All of them froze at the sound of the voice. They all recognized it because it was one they had heard quite a few times now during the battle. It was Leel's voice. Unforgivable. It appeared again, this time in a different place. Unforgivable. Again. Unforgivable. Again. Unforgivable. Again. The voice continued to sound from all around them, all of them quickly covering one another's backs as best as they could. From all sides, and all across the battlefield too, they could see energy slowly starting to rise from the ground, building up into the shape of a flamingo with Leel's head at the peak of its neck. Unforgivable. One burst out from the ground where they were, forcefully scattering them from the impact. The Leel that formed turned his full attention towards Ichigo, one of the only 2 still with enough power to fight back. But it was slow. All it would have taken was for Ichigo to swing his sword like before and it would be cut in half. Except he didn't swing. His grip tightened on the blade but he hesitated. Leel didn't, his peak shooting right towards Ichigo's chest. Before it could make contact, a dagger cloaked in black mist slammed into its head. In the next moment the energy was consuming Leel's form whole, the Quincy screaming as he was torn apart by whatever energy the new arrival had used. My, this is just embarrassing for you Mr. Hybrid, a mocking voice said, a silver-head man said as he landed close by, his arm still outstretched with the other holding another dagger. You and all your little friends almost cleared the level by yourself. It was so entertaining. Who are you? Ichigo asked suspiciously, his grip on his sword not lessening in the slightest. You're not on our side. Such hostilities already. The man chuckled before throwing his other dagger back, straight into the copy of Leel trying to attack him from behind. Just a bit of backup sent over from a mutual acquaintance. Gods are very tricky business, especially ones like these. They just won't stay dead. He paused as he glanced at the unmoving versions of Leel that had been killed. Well, at least this one's regeneration finally reached its limit. Got to say Miss Scarlet, that sword is no joke. Thank you, Urza replied, not being able to afford looking over her shoulder due to dealing with a Leal trying to kill her. You have yet to give your name. For the lovely lady, I suppose I should. The man's smile was anything but sinister when he said that, polluting his words with its menace. Jin Ichimaru, one of Emperor Spriggan's 12 bodyguards. And I'm sure you have heard of the other guy here. Other guy? Arcadios asked worriedly. One of Spriggan's elites here right now was bad enough. Depending who the other was, it could go from worse to hell. Who else is here? You'll probably be able to recognize his work, Jin said as he pointed off towards the largest group of Leals. They currently numbers the hundreds and yet they were all being decimated by large cone of fire. For those that had seen the breath attacks of dragon and god slayers however, it was a sight they all recognized. That's our very own self-proclaimed star. God Serena loves his entrances but he said there were simply too many side characters here today that he had to get rid of first. But have no fear, Jin added, though his smile didn't settle any of their worries. We aren't here to fight you today. We came to help, and I suppose to have some tea afterwards and talk. Alternatively we can leave, if you think you have the strength left to deal with this lot. More of Leals were forming but the rate of which it was occurring had slowed drastically. I doubt many more of him will spawn but it's not like you have the strength left to fight them all. So just leave this in the hands of your kind saviors. After all, what could you lose from trusting someone like me? Protector of the Fairies. Check the description for the links to the author.